artificial intelligence in government that came out at the end of last year. And in that policy, they say that we want to build trust. And in order to do that, we need explainability, right? So the government at the moment is on the hook for this claim. And I think that this claim itself is actually false. I don't necessarily want to throw explainability away completely. I think that it is important for certain kinds of projects to understand how these artificial systems work, but I don't think it's needed for trust. That's the sort of point that I want to focus on. Okay, so here's the example from the Australian government. They say public trust in AI and government's use of it is low, which acts as a handbrake on adoption. And we often see this claim being made around trust. People are worried about trust because they want AI to be used. I mean, that in itself is something that we can think about whether we want to buy that idea, right? Do we really want AI to be used? There's a sort of presumption that we should be using it. But if we do buy that, they then say, they give you some principles, and one of the principles is that it has to be explainable, okay? So in some sense, this is a long-winded way of saying that this policy is wrong. Okay, so I'm going to go through some different types of trust. As I said, philosophers have come up with lots and lots of different notions. In fact, one of the philosophers in the department here, Karen Jones, she's quite famous for coming up with some particular notions of trust. And as I see it, there's sort of three different notions, and I've graded them in terms of the strength of the concept. So a very weak notion of trust is a notion of mere reliance. The idea that you just, I'll give you some examples in a sec, but just rely on something without anything else, without any other conditions. Then there's a moderate notion of trust, which is reliance plus something else, but the something else that you add is not interpersonal. And that'll make sense when I come to the third one, the strong notion of trust. It's reliance plus something else that is interpersonal, right? There's some interpersonal aspect to the notion of trust. Okay, I'm going to give you some examples of these, but the point for now is just that this is going to clarify this core claim about explainability in three different ways. We've now got a way of looking to see if explainability is necessary for weak trust, moderate trust, or strong trust. We've got a sort of roadmap for thinking about how to assess this claim of necessity. Okay, so here's an example of weak trust where you just rely on a ladder not to break. So some people might say, look, you can trust the ladder, it's okay. And that seems like a fine thing to say in some sense. If you're thinking about a more moderate notion of trust, then the idea is that you rely on the ladder not to break, but you also add in something else. So the something else could be that you don't question the ladder, so you don't sort of go, oh, is it really going to be stable? Is it really not going to break? You just sort of take it for granted, or you don't continually monitor it. You don't just keep checking to see whether the ladder is going to break or not. In some sense, what happens with these moderate notions of trust is that the object sort of becomes an unquestioned part of your own agency. It's sort of like an extension of your body into the world, and you stop questioning its place and its capacity to work for you. The really strong notions of trust, right? So this is nothing about other people in here so far. The really strong notions of trust are all about other people. So when you trust in a strong sense, you rely typically on a person to act out of goodwill towards you, to act out of some moral commitment towards you, to act on your behalf for the right reasons, namely because they recognize your importance in the reasoning that they're doing. Something like that. And there's lots of different accounts. The account that Karen Jones here defends is something like this sort of moral commitment type picture. The idea being that if you trust someone, then they sort of have to feel a kind of moral obligation to uphold the promise that they've made to you by virtue of you investing trust in them. Okay. All right, so what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to go through these different notions of trust and consider the connection to explainability. And I'm also going to consider whether or not it's appropriate to rely on AI in this sense or appropriate to trust AI in this sense. So the first question, is it appropriate to rely on AI? And I think that the answer to this question is yes, particularly when AI is doing things better than us. And there do seem to be cases where AI does things better than we do. And in those situations, it would almost be sort of negligent not to rely on the system, right? If you've got a choice of two tools for building a house and you pick the worst tool, there's a sense in which you've made a mistake if you could have picked the other tool. Do we need to understand how the AI works in order for this reliance to be appropriate? My view is that we don't, so long as we can be confident that it's accurate and that it works across multiple different scenarios, so it's robust in its operation, okay? And we can usually be pretty confident of the accuracy of these systems. To sort of make the case, though, that we don't need explainability here, I'm just going to give you an analogy. Suppose someone uses their laptop for a number of tasks, but they don't have the faintest idea of how the laptop works. I take it that this is probably true for almost everyone in this room, right? But you know what it does, you know what it's supposed to do, and you also know that it does these things in a regular and predictable way. It seems completely fine for you to rely on the laptop in that scenario, right? You don't need, it's not like you're making a mistake because you don't understand how the system works. You don't understand how the laptop works, right? It seems completely okay to work with something even if you don't fully understand it. And as I said, it looks like we should rely on these systems when they can do things better than us. So here's the situation currently with diagnostic systems. So at the moment, if you go to the doctor, you might see them typing things into their computer. Sometimes what they're doing is they're typing in your symptoms into an artificial intelligence model to see what it says, okay? These models now are at the level of outperforming doctors in terms of diagnostic accuracy. It's a little bit controversial as to whether they outperform or whether they just perform equally well. It's pretty uncontroversial that they perform equally well, but there's some evidence that they outperform human doctors as well. Given that, it seems like a bad thing if we're not using it. And I think this is sort of where the push from people in terms of trust is coming from. Like, if this is the case, but people just don't trust it and so they don't use it, it looks like you're actually putting people's lives at risk because you're not using the best, most accurate diagnostic tool that you have available. But I don't think we actually need to understand how these work. I think if the doctor is using it and they haven't got the faintest idea of how it works, but they're confident of its accuracy and reliability, that seems good enough for me. I'm happy for the doctor to use that. In fact, I'd prefer the doctor to use that than maybe just relying on their own human mind, which might have various limitations. Okay, so this brings me to this moderate notion of trust. So examples of moderate trust include reliance without monitoring, reliance plus an unquestioning attitude. This idea that you don't just rely on something, but you're also just not checking how it works. You're not continually questioning the system. So an example that often gets used is relying on a rope to break, not to break without questioning it. So if you're a rock climber, you kind of need to take for granted that you've set the system up so that you can do the rock climbing without constantly monitoring and checking, because that's going to get in the way of a cognitive process involved with actually doing the rock climbing. Similarly, if we rely on a machine just in an automotive factory, for instance, to make widgets, and we don't check on it constantly, then we're sort of trusting the machine in this sense, in this moderate sense. So I think that this notion of trust is appropriate for artificial intelligence. We can trust AI systems in this sense. We can have a moderate notion of trust where we use the system, we rely on it, and we don't monitor it, we don't check it. But I also don't think that we need explainability in this case as well, and we'll just come back to the case of the laptop. You can rely on it, and you can rely on it without these other attitudes, without checking on it, without monitoring it. That seems perfectly okay because you have, again, confidence in the accuracy and the performance of the system. And those beliefs about the laptop can be formed without really ever explaining how the system works, just so long as its capacity to function is stable over time. Okay, so it seems like this moderate notion of trust is perfectly happy, even if we don't have any understanding of how a system works. And I think the same applies to an artificial intelligence. You can use it without monitoring or questioning it so long as you have this other information. Now, this other information about the reliability of the system involving accuracy, involving the robustness of the system, it's not completely straightforward to get this information. right? Exactly how we work out whether an artificial intelligence is accurate requires a sort of deep dive into the statistical analysis of these models, but we do have methods for checking this, hence the claims about the accuracy of diagnostic systems. I mean, one way to do it is to just like compare the outputs to what a doctor would give and see how reliable the AI is with respect to the outputs that the doctor would give. Okay, this brings me to strong trust. Now, I think explainability here is probably necessary for strong trust. I think that claim is right. So suppose that someone asks, suppose you ask your friend to look after your cat. To trust in this strong sense, you need to know whether your friend acts out of some normative commitment to you, acts out of some goodwill or the right reasons. You need to understand their reasoning process. If you don't have a grasp on their reasoning process, then you actually don't know if you can trust them. Right? So imagine giving your cat to a neighbor when they're a complete stranger. You would feel a bit uncomfortable about that because you wouldn't know whether if something went wrong, they would act in your best interests or the cat's best interest with you as proxy. Right? So it does look like you need to explain how these systems, how someone reasons when you're trying to trust them in this stronger sense. In any kind of interpersonal sense, you need to understand the person that you're trusting. So I think explainability is necessary, but I also think this is completely inappropriate for artificial intelligence. And the reason I think it's completely inappropriate for artificial intelligence is that in order to have strong trust in someone, and in order for that to be appropriate, they'd better be capable of doing things like moral reasoning. They'd better be capable of doing things like reasoning, or even just acting out of goodwill. And these systems, we use the letter I, indicating intelligence, but they're pretty dumb, actually, right? And in particular, they don't have mental states. I think I'm happy to go on the record for saying for that right now. There's controversy about this, right? I mean, when the first large language model came out, Lambda from Google, there was a Google engineer who came out in public saying that this thing is conscious. What are we doing? Yada, yada, yada. But I think it's implausible that these things are conscious. I think it's implausible that they have mental states. And if you're interested in why, that's a whole rabbit hole that we can go down some other time. At the very least, there's no evidence that they have moral commitments or that they reason about things. They just they're good at spitting stuff out, but there's the lights are on, but no one's home. Now, this might change in the future. I mean, this is the sort of question about artificial intelligence at the moment is where the hell is all of this going? Are we in the process now of eventually building things that will have full-blown minds, right? And you might wonder about the ethical implications of that kind of research and whether or not that research should be conducted in the way it's being conducted now, which is to say that it's mostly conducted by private corporations, right? Should private corporations be at the helm of driving forward artificial intelligence towards things that have full-blown minds? It's a big and difficult question. For now, these things don't have these mental states, and so strong trust is just not appropriate. Okay. So here's the result of what I've been saying. We've got these three different ways of thinking about the relationship between the notion of explainability and the trust in a system. Should we trust the system if we don't understand how it works? Do we need to have explainability in order to have notions of weak trust, moderate trust, and strong trust? And I think that these first two notions don't require explainability. We can see that just by thinking about other things that we trust in the same way. The third notion does require explainability, but it is at the moment inappropriate for artificial intelligence, although that might change. But at the point that it changes, then I think that the kind of explanations that we'll be looking for are exactly the kinds of explanations that you'd be looking for if you got your friend to look after your cat, right? You'd be looking to know whether these things are morally committed to you, whether they have reasons and so on. At which point I think it's much less interesting because they're really just people at that point, and we're just engaging with them as people, and that's fine. And we can just fold this whole discussion about trust in AI into trust in general, right? And that's just the same conversation we're going to have there. Okay, so some questions that arise from this for me. One of them is trust the right concept to focus on in the context of AI? Notice that the sort of argument I was running was focused on the necessity of explainability for trust in artificial intelligence, but also the notion of trust that I think most of us will intuitively have in mind, some interpersonal sense, just looks wildly inappropriate for artificial intelligence. So there's really a question about whether trust, given that it sort of has this connection to this interpersonal stuff, whether that notion of trust is really the right notion that we should be thinking about when we're talking about AI. Maybe we should replace trust with something like reliance or reliability and sort of try and clip away the conceptual baggage, the conceptual interpersonal baggage that's associated with the concept of trust. A second question is, are there other notions of trust or explanation that we should be thinking about? I mean, the philosophers are very good at just coming up with new ways of doing a thing, right? So we start with one concept of trust, give it 10 years and enough pressure to publish, and there'll be 15 different concepts of trust, right? Give it enough time, we might have uncountably many notions of trust. And so this project of looking at how we should trust artificial intelligence and the notion of trust, the kind of lens that we look at AI through, needs to evolve as we continually seek to understand trust itself. And the same thing applies to explanation. I haven't said a lot about what it is to explain how these systems work. I've just been sort of relying on your intuitive grasp of the notion of explanation, understanding, and hoping that you'll just come along for the ride. But there is a serious and very deep question about what explanation is in the context of these systems. How do we explain them? What would a good explanation look like? And that's an important question, particularly as it intersects with the notion of trust. The third question is this government policy off target? I mean, this government policy uses these notions of explanation and they use these notions of trust, and I worry that this is pushing us in the wrong direction because once it's policy at the governmental level, that's going to do things like inform research, inform the actual use of artificial intelligence, and they may be just making demands that can't be met, right? If they want it to be explainable in order to be trustworthy, well, they may just be thinking about a notion of trust that we can't have, or thinking about a notion of explanation that we can't have. The fourth question, and this is something that I'm sort of thinking about a lot at the moment, is whether it's useful to have people to trust AI in the really strong sense, even if it's inappropriate. So if you want to get people to use something, and I take it that this is why people are so interested in these notions of trust, then you really might want it to be the case that people do kind of think of them as like little people, right? That people interact with ChatGPT in a way that is more person-like, because they are more likely to use it in that situation. And if that's the case, you have this sort of situation where bolstering trust in AI looks like sort of buying into a kind of group delusion about the notion, about the sort of personal status of these systems. And you might wonder about the ethical implications of supporting a kind of group hallucination about whether or not these things are people. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
It's very interesting. I do have some questions, but let's open the floor to see whether someone else has any questions or comments or thoughts. Angel.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions. One question, simple question. When you talk about understanding AI, you are meaning who are you meaning? The end users or the developers? Mm-hmm. That the developers don't know really what they have created?
Yeah.
That's what you mean, or can you explain a little more?
I mean, I think it applies across the board, right? So the developers don't know what they've created. They don't understand what they've created, except in the sense that they understand how deep neural nets work. But once the thing is trained, they've got no idea what the actual passage through the deep neural net is. And it's impenetrable because of the complexity, right? The user has no idea how these things work. I mean, we have less of an idea. Most of us don't even have a concept of an artificial neural net and know how that works, right? So developers and users, but also people that are implementing artificial intelligence, those people are also on the table as people that don't understand and that maybe need to understand, and then companies that bankroll the whole thing. They don't understand. No one understands is the point. And that's going to hit in various different ways depending on the kind of obligations that you think we have to understand a system like this before we use it.
Yeah, and another question. You haven't said anything about this, but I wonder whether people are debating about ideas of dependency on AI. I find something that can be problematic if there is gradual adoption, what are dependencies seen as a problem for the future? Or
Yeah, I mean, I guess it depends on the case. So I think that, and this is why this sort of like, knowing how they work and knowing whether they're accurate and reliable is important. So in the case of medical diagnostics, say, I don't think people are super worried about over-reliance on the system if it's accurate. But they are worried about over-reliance on the system when we're not sure whether it's accurate or not, or we're not sure to the degree of accuracy. And so there is a lot of resistance and tension kind of in the medical community around these things because they might seem to be sort of unproven, and we shouldn't like rely on something unquestioningly if it's unproven. I take it that this is not special to AI, right? Like if there's an experimental surgical procedure, you don't know fully how like successful this procedure is, it would be kind of a mistake to rely on that too heavily as well. But once you have information about the reliability of the procedure, it seems okay, right? So I take it that there's like not really anything new here, and particularly because like doctors are finite beings, they don't understand how most of the stuff that they're using works anyway, right? So like, it seems okay so long as we have this information about accuracy and reliability. That said, there is the sort of interesting question about people entering into relationships with large language models, right? So there was a case recently about someone who had entered into like a really serious relationship on the face of it with a large language model, with ChatGPT in particular. And I don't know what to think about this. I don't know whether this is a problem or not.
Thanks. So I found plausible the idea that strong claim about explainability sort of is just too strong. But I wanted to ask you, what do you think about a more charitable, perhaps, interpretation there? Do you think, because you're sort of black boxing, robustness and accuracy in a way, but in most cases, we tend to ask for mechanisms, right? Precisely to be confident in the new case. And this is a parallel debate in the merely statistical evidence versus mechanistic evidence. It's just a couple of RCTs enough to trust the drug. Well, if you don't really know how it works, maybe you won't be sure, like in new cases. And what is a new case, right?
Yeah.
So it might be the case that people were sort of singling out explainability under the assumption that we will never get the robustness that you are sort of assuming there, because that assumes that that it's going to be accurate to the degree that you have seen it being accurate, but also in the new cases, which you can, right? In every time you're still estimating accuracy, right, or just trusting the previous accuracy that it's going to work there. Work there.
Yeah.
And explanation is just a natural way out of that. Right? So I trust my prediction out of sample because I know more or less what the model is doing.
Yeah.
What do you think about that more sort of charitable interpretation of why people are singling out, not the government, but
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a complicated issue. So let's think about drugs for a sec, right? Think about antidepressants. Does anyone understand how antidepressants work? Probably not, is the answer, right? What we do have is good statistical evidence, arguably, from like clinical trials and long-term use that they make a sort of significant difference to things like, depression and anxiety and stuff like that, right? Is it the case that we shouldn't use them because we don't fully understand how they work? Well, we've all sort of made a choice about that already, it seems, right? Like as a society, we've sort of been like, yeah, okay, we should use them because the positive effects sort of outweigh any like potential downsides that we might have from not fully understanding the thing. And I think you could just run the same argument with respect to the artificial intelligence. You can get to a point where you sort of understand how accurate it is. And even for new cases, right, the accuracy is usually with respect to like its likelihood of getting the right outcome for a new case. You can understand that accuracy well enough that, it's good enough, at least in the sense that we sort of take a bet on anything that we use where we don't fully understand it, right? Asking for the full-blown mechanistic details of like 175 billion neurons and everything moving through it just seems like sort of overkill when we don't demand that kind of explanation in other cases which have similar kind of stakes. So we don't demand it for antidepressants or drugs in general, really. Like we try very hard to get better understanding, but we absolutely use them without understanding how they work.
I mean, you can think that there's a lot of background assumptions that doctors have in the case of drugs.
Yeah.
They know the components, right? They know much more about the drug and the body than the parallel case. So
I think most doctors don't know much about drugs, actually. That's why we've got pharmacists. So like maybe the doctor's thinking there's someone who knows how this works and that's good enough. And that's like a sort of good bet for using the thing. I think that like for some drugs, that's just not true, right? Like there are some drugs that we really just don't have a good sense of how it works and we use it anyway. And I think it's just this question about, it's not just a simple matter of should we use it? Oh, we don't understand it, therefore we don't. It's just a trade-off between the degree to which we understand it and the opportunity cost of not using something on the basis of not fully understanding it. And we make that choice in such a way constantly where we don't for the full-blown explanation and we don't want to have to wait until we have it, although it would be nice to have it. But like I take the point, like I think it is a sort of complex issue.
So then I'm going to ask my question. I am interested in the language and the strategies used by intermediaries to build trust, in the sense that last time I went to see my GP, he did not admit to using artificial intelligence. So he's actually creating a facade of strong trust, pretending to be this caring person acting in my interest, but secretly he would be using an artificial model to assess my symptoms. Yeah. Similarly, do you see something in the language and the projection, for example, of banks? Do you see a change resulting from their use of AI in assessing clients' applications?
Yeah, I guess there's two questions there. I'll take the second one first. There's absolutely a change, and like this is one of the issues with these systems, and this is a reason to want explainability. What I'm about to say that is like just disconnected from trust. These systems can like they're trained on us effectively, right? And we are kind of awful in a lot of ways, right? We're racist, we're sexist, we're transphobic. All of these things are just like, it's trained on the internet and the internet is just full of that stuff, right? And so these systems will replicate our biases unless you do something about it. And so I don't know the details about the bank case, but here's a case, criminal recidivism prediction just systematically punishes black people once you use AI on it. Why is that? Because the data that it's trained on are criminal records and black people are overrepresented in the training data. And so it will just pick up that bias and replicate it.
Is there some kind of justification given as to why they would be using AI?
I mean, it's interesting. So the case there is that, the criminal recidivism prediction has been kind of quantitative for a long time. Right, so before the use of AI, you would have people sort of like come up with a number in an algorithmic way based on the data already. So they sort of had a quantitative approach, and then the AI is introduced to do that better. And it's similar in some sense in the diagnostic case, right? Like doctors are already kind of running a kind of quantitative analysis over you, and the idea is that the AI will just pick that up and do it better. Right, so I guess that's the sort of justification. It's like we've already sort of bought that this is the way to do it, and here's how you do it better. Explainability can help you to weed out biases, right? So it can help you to work out whether or not these systems punish black people. It's not the only way though, so it's still not a kind of necessary condition, right? You can look at the outputs and you can run like analysis on the outputs, and you can tell that it's punishing black people. And then you can do something about that. But explainability will help. So I guess that weaker claim, and this might speak to some of the things that you were saying, the weaker claim that explainability is helpful for trusting AI, that certainly seems right. My point is just that you don't need it. It's not necessary. The first thing you pointed out about the doctor and the sort of like self-effacing doctor. So it's interesting. I asked a doctor recently whether they thought that they had a moral obligation to tell their patients that they were using an artificial intelligence model. And their answer was no. Okay. Interesting answer. There's a study that's come out just recently which looks at whether, like, how likely someone is to consent given that the diagnosis was made by an AI versus a doctor, and there is a difference, right? And people, when asked about this, they may not feel like they have informed consent when they don't know that the AI is actually the thing that is part of the diagnosis. And so there could be pressure, like a kind of pressure from the notion of informed consent to inform patients of the use of AI systems. It's tricky though, right? Because your doctor before AI wasn't telling you about a bunch of other stuff they were using, right? They were using a database that had all of the symptoms in it. And these were not like AI systems, but they were probably decision trees. They were probably like very basic AI systems in some sense. And they weren't telling you about that. There's lots of stuff doctors don't tell you about, right? And so the question is whether the obligation to inform and to produce informed consent is especially poignant when it comes to AI. And I guess the question I want to ask at that point is, what is so special about AI that would justify making a special obligation to tell you about it? And I don't know what the answer to that question is.
It's an extremely ignorant question. I'm sorry, I'm an archaeologist, I dig holes. But how come that we don't know how the model was developed? It was designed initially by people. Aren't there any, records of their decision making?
So they're not designed by people. That's sort of the point, right? So this is like not a great analogy, but maybe it'll help. It's this sort of half truth, what I'm about to say. When the difference between these models and a computer program like Microsoft Word is sort of like the difference between evolution, right, and design. Okay, so when you make one of these models, it teaches itself what to do, right? So we know how to set up the conditions for that to happen, and we know how to press go. After that, we have no idea what it does, right? I mean, we sort of know at a very abstract level. We know that what happens is it takes information into each layer of the neural net, it processes that information, it adjusts the sort of weight that it applies to each neuron, then it passes it to the next layer, and then it does that, and then it feeds the whole thing through back again, and it just keeps going like that until it sort of settles on this massive statistical network of weights across the neurons that it's happy with, such that when you then feed in information, you get out. What we don't understand is like what the final picture looks like. We sort of know how it builds it, but we have no idea what the final algorithm that it's actually running to work out what it should say given an input ultimately is.
So it wouldn't be possible to adjust the decision-making parameters based on, let's say, humanly assessed feedback. Let's say we conduct a number of case studies, we analyze how correct AI is in, let's say, assessing or making a diagnosis. We can't.
You absolutely can do that. Yeah.
Okay.
You can have a human look over what the AI is doing, and as it's sort of training itself, you can have a human sort of say, okay, don't do that. So there's one AI that it thinks that a picture of an avocado and a picture of a cat are like, it'll classify them both as avocados, right? And so what you can do is you can get someone to come in and say, okay, don't do that, right? Like these are different. Don't over-generate your avocado-ness and apply it to the cats, right? And you can sort of push how it learns a little bit, but it then still just does this iterative process that we don't have any handle on. We don't know what each step is, and we don't know the final result. So you can guide them, but you can't, even though you guide them, it's sort of like, at that point, it's like guided evolution. You can guide evolution, right? But you can't be sure of what's going to happen at the end. Yeah.
One last small question. Your wildest prediction about AI in the future, let's say in 50 years, where are we as a society?
So I'm very very moderate about this stuff. So I'm not team Rise of the Robots. Oh God, we're all gonna die. I mean, I'm not. So I'm not team. They're gonna like take over. The robots are gonna take over. Like I think we should be worried about Elon Musk making a like a whole bunch of humanoid robots, which is what Tesla is currently doing. I think that's a horrifying idea. But that's horrifying because it's Tesla doing it, not because the AI system that's being used. My sense of the technology is that it is not like it will get better for what it's good at now, right? So it'll get better in terms of being able to mimic text, being able to make predictions and stuff like that. And we'll just see it getting better and better and better. My sense of the technology and the way that this works is that it's not how we function. It's not how a mind functions. And so I don't think we're going to get like intelligent things out of exactly this technology. So my wildest assumption over the next 50 years is that we have what we have now, but better. But we're going to hit a limit, and that limit is because of the way that the technology actually works. That's my guess. But like betting markets at the moment are like 2031, the singularity is going to happen. We're going to have machines building machines that are intelligent, more intelligent than themselves, and there's going to be an intelligence explosion, and then the world's going to end, and yada, yada, yada. So, but I don't know. I think that's implausible. Yeah.
Okay. One quick one. To what extent does the trust, the AI, depend on you being able to verify in some way what it's saying? I mean, when do we ever get to, or should we ever get to a situation where you just simply blindly trust something when particularly it could have catastrophic consequences, as distinct from? Just want a quick answer on something.
Yeah, I mean, I think that those weaker and more moderate notions of trust, they only are appropriate. So what you're asking is like, when is it appropriate to trust these systems effectively? And I think it's appropriate to trust those systems when you can verify and validate them, right? So you shouldn't just, I mean, this is the sort of problem in some sense that we have with people just using essays from GPT and handing them in, is that they haven't validated them, and GPT just makes stuff up all the time, right? And so those essays are just full of things that are false. And so that's a kind of blind trust in the system, which I just think is unwarranted. But once you verify it, once you've got a good bet on its functioning over time, then I don't see a problem in relying on it.
Well, there's that famous case of a bunch of lawyers making a big submission to a government inquiry. Used AI to generate all these cases, precedents, which turned out to be rubbish.
Yeah, it just makes things up. It'll invent research articles, it'll invent cases, it'll invent people. And that's because these things don't try and tell it, like large language models in particular, what they're doing is they're trying to guess the most likely thing to say given what you've asked of it. And guessing the most likely thing to say is based on training across a whole bunch of material where people have like said a bunch of things. And so it looks at that and it says, okay, well, given how people have responded, I should respond in this kind of way. But like, there's no sense in which that tracks the truth, right? You have to do something to get it to track the truth. There are ways of doing that, but in general, these things just make stuff up.
Okay, well, let's.
Thanks, everybody.
We have lunch in room 453 on the fourth floor, so the incoming wrap. Parts share even in times of austerity.
Thanks, Leaf.
No, thank you. Absolutely fascinating. I told you so much. And I'm absolutely sure that we really don't know how it functions.
No, we don't. No.
Everybody was awesome.
Yeah.
Stealing the microphone.
Officers provides further valuable material. While most general histories emphasise the triumphs and failures of the politicians, there's very little that speaks to the experiences and attitudes of those many forgotten or silenced engineers and senior civil servants. It's interesting that Australia rarely celebrates or highlights their contributions to our history. There is also very little secondary literature specifically dealing with Victoria's early colonial civil service and railway administration. Those that do give little prominence to the individual railway leaders and the challenges they faced. Michael Venn's 1982 thesis, Engineers and Politicians, goes the closest to rebalancing the scales. The general histories instead foreground endemic overmanning and the stereotypes of hangers-on or tax eaters, as James Service described the civil servants in the early 1870s, or hapless sycophants after Thomas Higginbotham was cut down. What is written of the first 30 years of railway administration and management repeats four themes. These include the failure of railway companies, the impact of patronage, log rolling, and ministerial interference. I will argue that the pejorative implications inherent in the private company failure are misplaced and disguise a longer, more nuanced struggle to define the role of the state vis-à-vis private enterprise, together with the colonial politicians' long-held ambivalence towards the civil service and increasing its role in railways. Much of this ambivalence, I will argue, was attributable to the fear of public pressure and the financial implications of giving into it. Although patronage and ministerial interference headlined the 1883 reforms, I argue that these aspects were mostly tolerated and criticised, depending on whether the politicians were in power or in opposition. By the early 1880s, however, the activities of two railway ministers did more to trigger calls for reform than the previous 22 governments. First, two times railway minister and self-proclaimed political general manager and railways brake inventor John Woods, and the second, the nefarious and corrupt Tommy Bent, who eventually became Premier. These two ministers exemplified ministerial interference at its worst. The lightning rod for public and press outrage was two railway accidents at Hawthorn and Jollymont in the early 1880s. It saw 5 people killed and 214 injured. Ferdinand Beaulieu was one of them. Seen here as a timeless reminder in the St Kilda Cemetery. And Punch's take on the reason for the 1883 Act. And you can see there, public opinion, the gentleman on the right, giving the boot to Woods and Tommy Bent. And I think we've got James Service or David Syme in the background. I can't work out who. And the controversy around Woods forcing his own brake invention on the railway department. However, dealing with political interference and ceding control to independent commissioners was not done without long debate and compromise, particularly those who favoured a more private enterprise-oriented management solution and those who saw ministerial control and accountability to Parliament as axiomatic and the essence of responsible government. What was interesting was the varying interpretations of what responsible government and ministerial responsibility meant in practice. It was actually an undefined term in the Constitution and left important questions relevant to railway management hanging. Who was accountable? Who was responsible? Two very different concepts. And the roles of Parliament, the executive government, departments, and how they navigated the boundaries of policy, administration and management. All this went back to 1857, when the government decided to borrow £8 million, which is over $2 billion today, to build the first trunk railways to the Port, Goldfields and Murray River. The revolutionary choice in 1883 to adopt a compromise solution in the form of an independent statutory authority was well understood by the political class at the time, and not a significant event identified by later historians. It did not go unnoticed overseas either. State ownership and control of railways was not unusual, and it was regularly referred to in the Victorian Parliament, mostly in the context of European developments, particularly Belgium's top-down approach rather than the private enterprise model in Britain and America. However, it was not state control per se that was the issue, but state control by popularly elected governments that either piqued curiosity or struck terror in the hearts of the politicians and businessmen in North America. And we see lots of references to the whims of the multitude, the temporary crazes of the mob, and local boomsters in Parliament. These are all references in overseas journal articles and pamphlets. Although this is not a comparative history, international precedents and concerns are important context for my narrative of our early railways administrative history. Interestingly, it seems that the first scientific investigation of early Australian railways was undertaken by a German academic in 1904, the same year that Henry Giles Turner published his history of the colony of Victoria. The so-called Octopus Acts of the 1880s, in which every constituency in Victoria won a railway, gave cause for alarm, and it is now accepted wisdom that excessive building of railways during the 1880s seriously exacerbated the worldwide depression in Victoria in the 1890s, far worse proportionally than the Great Depression of the 1930s. It also caused Parliament to substantially seize back control from the independent commissioners in the 1890s, but that's another story. In terms of structure of my thesis, broadly chronological and covers the key phases of railway and institutional development, each phase attempting to illuminate the relationships between railway departmental leaders, their ministers and Parliament. This includes the 1850s and 60s, which was dominated by very large construction projects underseen in detail by Parliament, and no less than 27 parliamentary inquiries and royal commissions. The early to mid-1870s, which saw a growing railways department, complex business, planning and commercial problems, titanic struggles over the standards of construction and gauge, revenue insufficiency and growing debt. Finally, the ascendancy of ministers and full political control with the purchase of the last private company in 1878, presaging political and management instability, ministerial interference and public outrage over the railway accidents. As a solution, the 1883 Act, which ceded control to independent commissioners, was, however, largely a fiction. Parliament retained total control over all the major business and policy matters. At least the Act ostensibly gave control over appointments to the commissioners, providing some check on political patronage, which had been tolerated for the previous near 3 decades. It would not, however, save the political class from the voters. When the economy began to crash in the late 1880s, that is, it also led to Victoria's longest and most expensive libel trial in the 1890s, after David Syme of The Age accused the Chief Commissioner of Railways of causing the depression because he didn't stand up to the politicians. So, in conclusion, whilst trains and railways have long fascinated economic and social historians, little scholarly work has been undertaken on the administrative and managerial aspects of this important aspect of our state's history. Hopefully, the insights gleaned will benefit public sector leaders and the politicians who select them and legislate the administrative and state business arrangements to deliver our vital public and utility services. Thank you.
You. We have 10 minutes for discussion. So,
Well, I'm just wondering, I know you said your thesis wasn't a comparative one, so I'm going to ask you about comparing it. But the history of the process of the railways went through over the period, was that, were there similar processes going on, say, with telegraphy and other government services? Is the Victorian Railways sort of so large and so different that it's individual, or is it part of an overall process within Victorian sort of state formation?
Yeah, look, it's a good question. Initially, they turned away from the concept of permanent public departments, and by the time the railways administrative evolution had started, they then actually started bringing back into government departments a lot of other activities. So a couple of exceptions, the Port Authority, which actually predated railways, was really a sort of, it was actually also a statutory corporation. And so it's a bit hard to say Victorian Railways was absolutely the first. But in terms of managing trading business, it was. I think one of the reasons it never got drawn into a department model, of which most activities ultimately were, including education after the boards were gotten rid of after 1872 and the like. One of the reasons is right up until 1876, they thought that when all of the government railways had been built, they would then be leased to the private sector, which was a model that was understood. But by then, they were such loss-making entities. They didn't quite figure out, as Jeff Kennett did, that you can still franchise even if they're loss-making. It just involves a subsidy. They just couldn't conceive of the private sector running a loss-making thing. But to answer your question specifically, a lot of those other ones, the telegraphs, I'm pretty sure they were departments. They were hived off also from the railways hived themselves off the telegraph people. My electricity friend.
It was great, Paul. Thank you very much. You alluded a couple of times early on to the kind of private suburban railways and the government rural railways, and then later on to the North American model, where, of course, municipal governments were heavily involved in urban rail right from the very beginning. I'm wondering to what extent you think urban-rural political divide played into any of these processes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the urban railways were profit-making. The Melbourne and Hobson's Bay United Railway Company, which lasted 25 years, was paying dividends right from the start. It, in fact, absorbed about 3 other private companies that failed. So that's why you just can't say they failed. They took them over. But they were making profits in the urban areas. In the country areas, that was where the politics really was. Absolutely, for sure. But the two come together in the 1870s, mid-1870s, right up to Graham Berry's second major victory, when you see urbanisation come to the fore. The urbaniser, the metropolis, really changes things. Cleaves through Berry's support base. Most of the radical liberals were country folk, all people like Longmore, and that dominated because it was all about opening up the lands, the big fights with the squatters, the merchants and miners getting the railways in to advantage their business interests. So all that is the country areas. But the politics just becomes so confused in that 1878 to 1882 period. And ultimately, very, very reluctantly, they buy that. They didn't want to. And another reason is the public pressure. They said, oh my God, they'll want more railways. And absolutely they did. And my friend Tommy Bent, and then others after him, satisfied that with thousands of miles of more railways. financed by very willing British capital. So, sorry.
Thanks, Bob. That's really interesting. You said almost as an aside, I think, that George and Thomas were brothers.
Yes.
Is that an example of the nepotism you're talking about, or?
No, not at all. Their politics, it is interesting. I think Geraldine Moore wrote a nice little book about George Higginbotham. They lived together. Thomas was unmarried, and they lived together with George's family down on Beaconsfield Parade, actually. Harmoniously, they got on very, very well at a personal level, but their politics was entirely different. And Higginbotham actually left politics, I think, in the early 1870s. He was defeated by Bent, which was, this grand Liberal gentleman. But no, there was no nepotism in.
I guess my question then is in relation to that partly. To what extent in your methodology are you, or is it not relevant, able to kind of follow in an almost kind of prosopographical way some of these key players in both state and private sector in terms of their familial and other associational connections? And is that?
It is not, that is not as big an issue as just it wasn't so much family nepotism, although you've got instances with Berry and certainly with Bent, but in terms of the broad sweep, it was favouring constituencies, friends, people who are going to vote for them. So it's not a big line of inquiry.
Last question.
I'm not a historian, I'm an archaeologist, but I'm actually from Belgium. And while you were talking, I was thinking about this magnificent railway station that we have.
Yes.
I don't know if you know it. It's constructed as a neoclassical temple dedicated to the idea of the progress, with a clock really in the center of the pediment, let's say. And I was just wondering whether you see a similar kind of building program put in place by Victorian authorities to express this same kind of control of progress.
Oh, absolutely. But it was a feature of the government railways. It wasn't a feature of the private railways. Everyone complained bitterly about the poor accommodation. But on the government railways, the magnificent railway stations at Maryborough, if you know there, or up through Ballarat, beautiful. I mean, the engineers prided themselves on this. It's interesting you mentioned the clock, because I've discovered in the public records this correspondence between Bent and the chief engineer at the time about putting a clock in. He needed a big clock to I don't know, show how grand and great this was. But it was vilified by the later, by the 1870s and 80s as prolific and expensive. And, it became a primal wound for politicians for, I reckon, 50 to 80 years. All these incredible viaducts and railway stations and maybe they got the idea from Belgium. They knew all about Belgium. I was just surprised how incredibly aware they were of things that were going on there. But Belgium was very different in terms of the drivers. It was military, fear of other countries taking over their railways, and that's why they nationalised them. But there was a state department. It wasn't a statutory authority. Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much again.
Great.
Very probably we have a very long break now. It's actually hard to put together the program. So I hope to see you back here. I think in at 3:10 for another very interesting history talk, and then there's more history and more history. We have Afternoon, well done you.
And there's the mic. Great.
Probably wear it, or is it good there?
Pardon? You probably wear it, yeah. Cool. Yeah, so it's muted, so just unmute it when you start.
It's 20 minutes paper plus 10 minutes questions. 15 fine. 15 plus fine. Oh, how intellectually generous. Whose plan was that?
Should all be set up.
Great, thank you.
Okay, everyone, we're going to start because it's time. Welcome back. This is a rather exciting session for us pre-modernists in the room. Will Hopp, my really wonderful PhD student, is going to be speaking on some of his work to do with the history of effective allegiances and the personifications of Robin Hood in the late Middle Ages, early modernity. The title of Will's paper today, Many Misdoers Being of His Clothing, Robin Hood, An Effective Allegiance in Medieval and Early Modern Communities. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming. So this presentation is made up of key aspects from the second chapter of my thesis on the performance and presence of Robin Hood. So this presentation is inherently about tension, about the ways Robin Hood represented the ability for anyone in the 15th and 16th centuries to engage in public discourse by identifying with the outlaw and adopting his identity through performance. It's almost a tradition in scholarship concerning the literary Robin to point out what he was not in the period. He did not rob the rich to feed the poor. He was not a champion of the oppressed. Rather, he rewarded adherence to social order and punished transgression and greed. Robin was just as likely to beat and rob a member of lower, middle, or higher classes. His rigid enforcement of social order, both above and below, lent him, and by extension anyone performing his character, an air of social authority. This identification with Robin Hood through material culture, the wearing of his costume or a livery badge in honor of the outlaw during these public performances, is a source for potential crises of allegiance within conflicting social parties. To begin, I'd like to propose my reading of Robin's legal status of outlaw. Robin was a relative latecomer to what has become known as the British outlaw genre, joining such heroes as Hereward the Wake, Fulk Fitzwarren, and Gamlin. There is a binary framework in these stories which establishes quite clearly that outlaws and the state of outlawry are not positive. Outlaws are bad people. Their environments, typically forests, are dangerous, wild places. But our heroes are not really outlaws. They are good people who have been forced into a state of outlawry by conquerors or despots. In the tale of Gamlin, for example, our hero is cheated of his inheritance by his wicked brother. Gamlin flees to a wild wood with one of his late father's servants, and they join a band of outlaws. This is not a merry band, however, as they rush home thankfully when news of their pardons appears. The wood is a bad place, where the rule of law, though twisted by some members of society, remains these outlaws' only salvation. Outlaw environments are less this and more this. Even the text which gave these generic environments their name speak of this life negatively. In the Outlaw Song of Trailbaston, an early 14th century poem, the author bemoans his unfair legal treatment, having fled to the Verbois, the greenwood, in defiance. Yet he makes his plea to his audience. May God curse whoever put me in this place. I ask that all good men should pray for me that I might go to my country. He cannot wait to leave the greenwood. But Robin Hood is different. He occupies similar spaces, his own greenwood, either Barnsdale in Yorkshire or Sherwood in Nottinghamshire. But this is actually a happy place, with feasts and fellowship, a true home. The forest is the place for outlaws, and Robin's place is in the forest. We are never told the reason for his outlawry in medieval narratives, only that he belongs there. There is then an inherent questioning of power structures embedded in Robin's ambiguous place in the generic outlaw's forest, now termed joyful. His choice to be an outlaw is crucial. Outlaws are bad people, but Robin is a good person, stated in several poems, but also evident from his behavior. If he is a good person, why is he an outlaw? What law did he break? Was it a bad law? Even if he did break the law, was he forced into this state? And if so, why did he remain an outlaw? The answer may be the sum of these questions. The surviving literary texts from the Middle Ages emphasize how Robin and his men held up travellers and judged them on their honesty. It's an open-ended question, asking audiences whether they might pass through the very real forests of Sherwood and Barnsdale as opposed to the fictional forests of the outlaw genre unmolested. Robin signifies the restoration of social balance, or else the social authority to do so. Robin is not radical. He is orthodox in his piety, he is loyal to the king and to his fellow yeomen in the forest. Everything about the medieval Robin emphasizes cohesion, not chaos. Nevertheless, he could be a dangerous enabler of personal and group agency. The tradition has always been performative. The literary story world was the product of the use of Robin Hood as a negative criminal alias, applied at an administrative distance in the 13th century, which was, by the end of this century, adapted by individuals to become their personal family names. The criminal characteristics of a Robin Hood were renegotiated into something positive or else socially acceptable, though there were, of course, detractors. Before the literary texts begin to appear in historical record, texts which mention Robin are largely critical of him and those who enjoyed his stories. Yet the popularity of Robin could not be ignored, and it is here that we get into the meat of this presentation's theme of social tension. In 1439, a petition was brought to Parliament which begged assistance in hunting down a group of men led by one Piers Venables. After a John Foreman was arrested for miscellaneous offences, Venables, in a manner of war, riot, and insurrection, arrayed with force and arms, and took away the said John. The petition continues. After that time, the same Piers Venables, having no livelihood nor sufficient goods, gathered unto him many misdoers, being of his clothing, and in manner of insurrection went into the woods in that country, like as it had been Robin Hood and his men. Scholars have interpreted Venables' act as the mob freeing a man they felt wrongly imprisoned, but that's probably a polite way of saying that they sprang their mate from custody. In any case, they each wore matching clothing, uniting through a visual marker. Or else, the phrase implies a personal, affective connection between the men. It's important to specify that Piers Venables did not call himself Robin Hood. Rather, the actions of this group reminded those penning the petition of the outlaw tradition. Another possibility is the petitions describing Venables' men this way to elicit a response from Parliament, likening the band to the rogues of Sherwood Forest. There are many rhetorical tools at work here. Yet for Venables, this theme of fellowship, which is a constant through line in the medieval poetry, was clearly an enabler. Whether the thought of the outlaw came across his mind at all, we don't know, but there was a desire by the group to be seen as unified. Whether or not the events happened in precisely the way they are given in the petition, it still tells us the ways in which Robin Hood's band was conceived. A brief look at another 15th century example shows the extent to which people were willing to push the boundaries of this identification. In 1498, the men of the towns of Wednesbury and Walsall, near Birmingham, got into a series of physical altercations and were forbidden from attending the fair at neighbouring Willenhall to avoid further scenes. Inevitably, they did attend, and they beat each other up. A Roger Marshall led the riot, taking the name of Robin Hood. Marshall later appeared in court to defend his actions, where he protested that he was simply doing what hath been of old times used and accustomed on the fair day, with captains called Robin Hoods, to the intent to gather money to the profit of the churches. Probably just his legal defence rather than a description of his actions, Marshall was leveraging the then widespread performance of Robin Hood as a fundraising figure to justify his behaviour. Robin appears most frequently in these summer play games and fundraising processions from late in the 15th century, and his presence exploded in popularity in the early 16th century. Men would dress as Robin and Little John, donning green hats and coats, sometimes with bows and bucklers, and would collect donations from locals to raise funds, almost exclusively for church building and repairs, the profit of the churches that Roger Marshall referred to. In some areas, in return for their donation, people would receive a paper livery badge, marking them out as one of Robin Hood's men. This was evidently popular in some areas, such as Kingston upon Thames, with 3,500 badges made for donors in 1507. Badges were also given out from the reigning Summer Lord, another fundraiser, but it is with Robin that we see a more subtle use of the badge. Rather than identifying a donor more generally under the reign of the Summer Lord, who in many cases was performed by the actual Lord of the Manor, or else another high-ranking member of the community, donors to Robin Hood were brought under his leadership, often played by a church warden, a trustworthy and respectable figure elected by the community to the post. These donations were more than just generous giving to the community at large. By donating to Robin Hood and receiving a badge and becoming effectively one of his men, donors signposted their allegiance to a figure who exercised a more or less autonomous validation of community members. The optics of such authority vested in Robin by this reciprocal relationship could present difficult challenges to figures of hard power, which also utilized the imagery of the outlaw tradition. In the early 16th century, for example, Henry VIII famously cast his own yeomen of the guard as Robin Hood's men, and he didn't need to change a thing about their aesthetic to do so. On the 1st of June 1515, Henry and Catherine of Aragon were entertained at Shooter's Hill in Greenwich by Robin Hood and 100 of his archers. Henry's yeomen dressed in their own Tudor livery of green and white to become instead Robin Hood's men. Robin greeted the king and escorted him to a feast where the royal couple were treated to a display of archery by the assembled company. The guard's primary function as protective archers and their livery, the pied Tudor green and white, would appear a natural fit for the outlaw band, who by this time had become identifiable in public performance and literature alike by their coats of Lincoln or Kendall green. Richard Gibson, master of the revels, ordered several items for this event which alludes to new, although unaltered, uniforms for the guards, as well as matching garb for Maid Marian and Friar Tuck, as we see here. 558 yards of Kendall for 123 jackets for Gay and Vaughan, the men playing Robin and Little John, and the King's Yeoman. 3 3/4 yards of red cloth and a kirtle and green cloth for Thomas Fellers, who was Maid Marian, and a habit, hood, and scapulary for Winsby, who played Friar Tuck. Along with Robin's cast of characters, the rest of the party matched the yeomen of the guard's distinctive uniform, tying them to the outlaw band as much as to the Tudor crown. White and green sarcenet gowns for Lady May and her company. The guard's visual identity is being equated to Robin's band of outlaws as a perfect fit, with the authority of Robin and Henry both confirmed. It is important to note that the king wore 2 brand new suits of green himself on Shooter's Hill. Though Robin is being played by one of Henry's own officers, the intersections of authority blur. They are Robin's men, Robin is the king's man, but Henry is also one of them. Henry's public performance as the figure at once ruling over yet equal to Robin may have proven too uncomfortable to sustain in future events. Henry had taken part in a Robin Hood game years previously, in 1510, where he himself played Robin as a violent bandit. He and 11 of his closest companions stormed the Queen's chambers and staged a mock fight and a dance, much to the lady's surprise. Henry's Robin Hood is the violent miscreant hinted at in earlier records. The pageant of 1515, however, was overseen largely by Gibson, a hasty replacement for a cancelled wedding celebration. The aesthetics of the Yeomen of the Guard may have just been an easy fix. This Robin Hood pageant is certainly very different to the king's own conception of the outlaw tradition when he has more of a hand in planning affairs. How might he respond to such direct comparisons between himself and, as he saw it, a crude bandit? There appears to be some concerted effort in public spheres, from playwrights to the king himself, to navigate away from the publicity of green clothing and appropriate it for new personalities. The Yeomen of the Guard ceased to be dressed in their green uniform, transitioning to their now iconic green uniform as early as 1519, though not with regularity until the 1520s. After this time, we see the emergence at court of Henry VIII's famous fool, Will Somers, by 1535. This man, we know, wore a green tunic as if a uniform himself. Peter Anderson, in his recent biography of Somers, notes the regularity with which green cloth was ordered for Henry's fool, while almost invariably sporting the clothing in commissioned artworks, which indicates both the publicity of and the royal insistence on his appearance. Anderson notes that green clothing was still associated with Robin Hood, though he does not speculate on what some of these connections may have been. For our purposes, we can perhaps see in Henry's insistence on Will Somers' green clothing a similar insistence on his evident foolishness to contemporary eyes. Here, Henry may have dressed Somers in green to remove the outlaw of some of his credibility. Robin Hood was the fool. While the Tudor green remained, for example on the English naval ensign, green as a uniform was replaced. This, of course, would have only had a limited influence. As we see throughout the remainder of the 16th century, the colour would remain attached to Robin in public performances and in prints of poems and plays. The issue here is one of the active repurposing of the colour for other characters. Robin's first appearance on the professional stage, for example, is not in A Tale of His Own, but a cameo in the 1590 play, A Pleasant Conceited Comedy of Georgia Green, likely an adaptation of an existing tradition. Georgia Green, the lauded Pinder of Wakefield, is a rival yeoman hero to Robin Hood. The issue here is one of the active repurposing of colour, either to sully it or to attach it to an alternate hero. The play's villain is the Earl of Kendal, another man with green in his name. Georgia Green foils the Earl's rebellion against Edward I, but not before a comic interlude in which he roundly defeats a comparatively minor opponent, the famous and now jealous Robin Hood. In this play, we see the negotiation of colour and clothing being used not to simply discredit the allure of Robin Hood, as Henry VIII may have done, but rather in an attempt to provide an alternate hero who wears this colour, an appropriation of the positive affect of his garb, while also providing not one, but a bit awkwardly two antagonists in green. This move seems relatively successful, if only incidentally, as the truly politicized Robin Hood was more or less erased from mainstream adaptations 8 years later, in 1598, with the performance of The Downfall of Robert Earl of Huntingdon, in which Robin is given an origin story as a wrongfully outlawed nobleman, like other literary outlaws before him. In pushing Robin to the periphery, the way back in was for him to conform to the very literary tropes which enabled him to stand out from the crowd in the first place. The true good outlaw was now gone. What I hope to have demonstrated is the dual positive and anxious affect of public identification with Robin Hood in the early years of structured forms of play and performance of the character. That Robin represented the ability to address social concerns, if not resolve them systemically, all too easily allowed people like Piers Venables and Roger Marshall to exploit playing similar roles to their own ends. Robin's fame became so great that the king's own bodyguard publicly performed as the outlaw band, perhaps representing the point at which the genie was out of the bottle. Despite his fame, what we see across the back half of the 16th century is not an increase in Robin's public performance, but a concerted effort to control and alter the content of the story world, to bring Robin back down to earth and underfoot. Thank you.
What a brief moment for questions. So do people have questions for Will? Let in all the people. So quick question.
Will, we've already chatted about your work, so I probably don't have too much to add. I just, as someone who uses visual sources a lot, it was really, really interesting and fascinating. But I wanted to ask about your decision to sort of have a kind of meta commentary of 19th, 20th century imagery running alongside your analysis in an unspoken way. And is that something that you engage with in your thesis? Can you just tell us a little bit more about how you see that operating in terms of your analysis and how you want people hearing your work to engage with it as well?
Yeah, so it's sort of a constant struggle with a lot of Robin Hood studies to unpick just how well known some of these images are. So a lot of time has been spent sort of saying, like I said at the start, what Robin isn't. And that has affected a lot of the ways that people read this earlier evidence because they're assuming that they're going to find what they expect to find in this imagery. And so one of the things that I do in this particular chapter is sort of unpick the origin of green as being just Robin's and therefore becoming everyone else's, and sort of flipping the script a little bit. So that sort of remains, I think, an unspoken thing throughout the whole thesis of saying, here is what people think based on modern media especially. Here is what people have assumed in the past based on that imagery, but unpicking the fact that it is actually based more on modern conceptions than it is on the historical record. So there's a lot of very, very recent overdue work being done to sort of wind back some of those assumptions because of this. But it's also a case of necessity because there just aren't any original images of Robin Hood really until we start getting into more modern printing cultures. So they're all recycled images. So the first original image of Robin isn't until like the very, very late 18th century. So it's almost out of necessity having to use these sort of visual tools, but that then folds back and becomes a good sort of teaching aid, I guess, and sort of unpicking the tradition.
Probably got time for one last. Hang on, but one question. Is there another question?
No, okay, we'll
Hi Sarah, how are you?
For you,
I'm good.
ready to go.
Excellent. I don't know if this is recording. I think it's recording. Doesn't.
Ready to go?
Yeah.
Afternoon, everyone. My name's Sarah Wills. It's my great pleasure to be the committee chair for Josh's PhD, very ably supervised by my colleague Mark and also Philip Goad from Architecture, Building and Planning. We're going to be having a confirmation panel here talk, and we're going to be looking at nation building with style and architecture in the non-Russian Soviet republics. So I'll just hand over straight away to you.
Thank you, Sarah. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah. I'm not sure if we're recording because my other supervisor isn't able to attend, but I'll just presume we are for my own mental well-being. Okay, so it's really fair to say that the architecture of the Stalin era has not been a popular topic among architectural historians. And part of the reason for that is that it isn't generally considered to be very good. It's often talked about as if it's some grotesque, distorted form of architecture that, as Jonathan Mead said in his documentary film Joe Building, is a glorification of the state, which is achieved by obeying state thought. In the histories that are out there, the architects themselves are largely relegated to the background, so that it often appears that Stalin himself is the true architect of the style that bears his name. As historian Boris Groys wrote, art and cultural production of the period was a mimesis of Stalin's will, and Stalin's will, as we all know, was quite imposing. If we take this interpretation at face value, we would rightly expect the architecture of the Stalin era to be monolithic and uniform, the same sort of pompous propagandistic buildings and motifs repeated endlessly over the vast cultural empire which he administered, which at its peak really stretched from Berlin to Beijing. And yet when we look around the Soviet Union, particularly in the non-Russian republics, we don't find that at all. Instead, we find wide stylistic diversity. In fact, we find that each of the 15 national republics of the USSR developed its own sub-variant of the official state style, which was generally connected to their local built traditions. Just on this slide, we can see Stalin-era buildings based on early Armenian church architecture, medieval Azeri palaces, 18th century Ukrainian Baroque, Central Asian Islamic iconography, and looking at the broader Soviet Empire, the clean, restrained, white surfaces of German modernism in East Berlin. So that rather than talking about the monolithic phenomenon of Stalinist architecture, we should actually talk about the many architectures of the Stalin period. And that is essentially the story that I want to tell. With that in mind, I developed research questions to understand what, and critically who, was behind these many national architectures. First of all, why did the USSR allow or even encourage each of these national groups to develop their own architectural style? Were the national architectural styles shaped by local architects and actors in the non-Russian republics, or were they developed and imposed by Moscow as the imperial master? And how did local and systemic factors determine a national group's ability to chart its own architectural course within the Stalinist system? There are several historical debates that these questions tap into. Firstly, the history of the Soviet national minorities, and namely, as Mark Eaterly framed it, the debate about whether the Soviet Union was a breaker or a builder of nations. Some, like Richard Pipes, would say that the USSR crushed the national aspirations of minorities and effectively reconstituted the Russian Empire. Others would say that the Soviets cultivated, or in some cases even invented, the nations that made up the USSR and today are the successor states. My research engages with these debates by showing how architecture specifically was a tool of nation building in both a literal and a figurative sense. There's also a long-running debate about whether the Soviet state and Stalin were all-powerful and controlled everything. Meads and Roys, who I mentioned, would probably say that it was. But there are many who have challenged that interpretation, such as Timothy Coulton, who shows that the state was in actuality an agglomeration of competing interests and hundreds of different agencies and groups that often didn't see eye to eye and were very hard for even Stalin to control. So we need to understand Soviet society both from the bottom up as well as the top down. Then there's a related question of what was the relationship between the architect and the client in Stalin's USSR? Vladimir Paperny suggested that architecture and client were fused as one. But did this mean that the architect was empowered by state authority or crushed by its weight? And finally, my work needs to engage with the broad literature on socialist realism, which was the overarching cultural doctrine of the USSR and one which architects were expected to follow. So I want to start by talking about this term socialist realism and thinking about how it applied in architecture. The socialist realism was initially developed in the 1930s as a doctrine to guide Soviet literature before it was extended to all other creative fields. Historian Tijana Bohosevich has called it the art of turning environments into microcosmic representations of the Soviet order, to promote it as the paradigm of beauty, wealth, and harmony. So what this really meant was that Soviet novels and paintings were expected to give moral instruction, such as this painting of Alexei Stakhanov, showing his colleagues how to use a pneumatic drill so that they too can become heroes of socialist labour. Inspiring stuff. Socialist realism was also about showing the radiant communist future, depictions of happy, well-fed factory workers, smiling collective farmers, and people of all nations getting along famously. Now, architects really struggled with how to apply socialist realism in their field. How can a building give moral instruction or depict the radiant future? Doesn't really make sense. What happened in practice is that socialist realist architecture emerged gradually as particular buildings were selected and then venerated as exemplars of the style. So that over time, certain conventions of socialist realist architecture crystallized. I've listed out some of these conventions. So firstly, it was not modernist in the sense that it was a rejection of the modernism of the 1920s and Western modernism, which was condemned as formalist or box architecture. Its buildings were typically monumental and based on principles of classicism, which was seen as the high point of architectural history. But they also fused elements from different traditions, so Renaissance ornament, Egyptian decoration, sometimes Gothic references, Art Nouveau, contemporary American styles like Art Deco, and of course, references from different national architectural traditions. And critically, it was ensemble architecture, meaning that buildings were not planned in isolation, but were coordinated to give an overall effect. And you can see in the 1934 Moscow General Plan how this works, and basically the entire city planned around the Palace of the Soviets, which was to be the tallest building in the world. And this became the model for other Soviet cities. Another central tenet of socialist realism was the idea that architecture should be national in form, but socialist in content. And this was really the green light for non-Russian architects to mine their national histories for appropriate forms. Now, there were, in my view, two main reasons why Stalin encouraged this. Firstly, as Terry Martin described in his book Affirmative Action Empire, allowing minority groups to express their cultural identity served as a safe outlet for national aspirations, particularly in lieu of political sovereignty. As opposed to the Russian Empire, which had sought to Russify the minorities, impose the language and particular styles on them, this policy allowed the Soviets to claim that they were actually the champions of the minorities, so a family of nations. And secondly, it allowed socialist content to be conveyed in a language that resonated with the people of the different parts of the USSR. In other words, co-opt locally specific symbols and icons, even religious ones, and then use them to talk about socialist themes and values. So socialist realism became the official state policy in the early 1930s. And from then on, we start to see an explosion of national architectures. So I wanted to look at a couple of examples because the way that I'm approaching my PhD is through a series of probably around 8 or 9 case studies of different republics and architectural projects. My first case study is Armenia, and in particular, the capital city of Yerevan. So Yerevan was a reasonably small town that really boomed after World War I when it became a refuge for Armenians who were fleeing the genocide in the Ottoman Empire. And in 1924, the Armenian architect Alexander Tamanyan developed a plan to take the city from around 20,000 to around 250,000 people in the space of a decade. So a very radical urban planning initiative. And he called for much of the old town to be levelled and replaced with classicized buildings based on the ancient religious architecture of Armenia, all done in the distinct local stones from the region to give it that ensemble effect. So it was going to be very patriotic, evocative buildings for this new Armenian Soviet Republic, which had been founded in 1920. Even the patterns on the main square, you can just see, were laid out to look like a traditional Armenian rug. Manyan's designs explicitly referenced archaeological sites such as the Zvanots Cathedral, which had recently been excavated, as you can see in the Yerevan Opera House on the left. Now, Tamanyan starts this work in the mid-1920s, almost a decade before socialist realism. But in the 30s, his work is then celebrated as being exemplary of this idea of national informed socialist in content. In fact, he even claims to have played a hand in inventing the idea. So thinking about my research questions, why was Armenia able to develop its own national style at such an early stage with very little assistance from the Moscow authorities? Well, firstly, Armenia already had this coterie of highly experienced architects like Tamanyan who were primed to take a leading role in the profession. Armenian national identity was already very strong and deeply rooted, and there was a vibrant national movement, particularly in response to the collective trauma of World War I and the genocide. And Armenia also had a very rich architectural culture going back 2,000 years that they could draw on. So the stars really aligned for Armenia to confidently step forward and assert its architectural identity at this early stage. A different story was unfolding over the border in Azerbaijan and in the capital city of Baku. But Baku, before the revolution, had been very rich, a very rich cosmopolitan city with extravagant architecture, which had been paid for with a massive oil boom around the turn of the century. And it was often called at the time the Paris on the Caspian. But before the revolution, the local Muslim population were largely excluded from the architectural profession, which was really dominated by Russians and Central Europeans who would come for the oil money. And until the early 20th century, there really was no distinctive Azeri national movement. Local political parties emphasized the broader Islamic community or the pan-Turkic movement, but less so their distinctive Azeriness. But the revolution and the civil war spurred on and really catalyzed the Azeri national movement, and the Soviet authorities encouraged this, most critically by establishing the Azeri Soviet Socialist Republic in 1920. Shortly after that, architectural schools were set up in Baku, and the new crop of Azeri architects, like Sadiq Dadashev and Mikhail Husseinov, started to look at the region's heritage for an architecture that represented their new republic. And they especially honed in on the 15th century Islamic traditions of the region. And you can see here the similarities between, on the left, the palace of the Shirvan Shahs in Baku and the Azeri pavilion that Dadashev and Husseinov built at the Moscow exhibition grounds. But they also looked to the extravagant pre-revolutionary architecture of the Baku oil barons. So here you can see a large residential building from the 1930s on the left, where the two architects actually lived, called the House of Scientists. which is clearly referencing the building on the right, which was a pre-revolutionary mansion of one of the local industrialists. Both buildings combine classical references with Islamic elements, including these stylized minarets. So we can see how Azeri architecture is following its own distinct course. Unlike Armenia, it doesn't have a ready-made crop of architects in the 1920s or really a unified architectural identity. But as the first batch of young Azeri architects are coming out of the Soviet universities in the early 30s, they quickly develop a modern, homegrown, and really quite creative Azeri style out of these different historical threads. Now, if we go further east to the Uzbek Soviet Socialist Republic in Central Asia, we again see something quite different. Soviet authorities often expressed a highly condescending view of the Central Asian republics, repeating stereotypes about their Asiatic backwardness, in quotes. And partly because of this, but also because of the rapid urbanization of the region and the lack of local architects for that task, Moscow commissioned Russian architects to redesign Tashkent. And these Russian architects, like Alexei Shushev and Stefan Poloponov, made an effort to engage with local traditions. So both of these buildings are named in honor of a local 15th century poet, Alisher Navoy, and they've been decorated, oh, sorry, I'm on the wrong side. Both of these buildings, and they've been decorated by local craftsmen. But as historian Greg Castillo has pointed out, this type of architecture often comes across as really superficial ornament on a typical neo-technical Stalinist frame without any deep engagement with local building traditions. I mean, if you take away the ornament, you put one of these buildings in Moscow. In fact, Castillo has called this type of architecture an example of Soviet Orientalism, pointing out that it has similarities to other imperial hybrid architectural styles like that of the British Raj. So on my preliminary reading, acknowledging that I have a lot of work ahead of me, this looks like quite a different process to what is happening in Armenia and Azerbaijan. So they're all very fluid observations at this stage, but they've led me to a working hypothesis, which I'll read out, and I don't like doing this, but the processes and the forces that shape the national subvariants of Soviet architecture differed significantly according to the conditions in each republic. In some instances, the national architectural idioms emerged organically from local architects, drawing on deeply rooted national traditions. In others, they were largely implanted by architects from the imperial metropole, primarily Russians, who had their own skewed preconceptions about local identity and traditions. The more we look at these national subvariants, the more they resemble separate architectural cultures that developed under their own unique conditions. In terms of sources, I'm looking at journals and media, published compendia, online archives, and then whatever archival or primary sources I can collect in the republics themselves. And because Soviet architecture was very heavily theorized and discussed as it was built, there is a rich body of sources that I have to work with. I am having some difficulty locating more local media in the republics, but I do hope to address that when I go there. And finally, of course, the buildings themselves are crucial primary sources, as is always the case with architectural history, and particularly given that Stalinist architecture can so easily be read as a text. My methodology cuts across architectural history, both using formal analysis and architectural biography, methods from nationalism studies, which focus on how national identity is fostered and how traditions are invented, and social and political history of the USSR, which I've touched on. And my process involves data collection phase, which I'm deep into, field research to really zero in on the detailed case studies from the different republics. I can't cover all the republics, obviously, because that would blow out my scope, but I think I can get a representative sample. And then ultimately arriving at an explanatory model to account for the different ways that the national architecture is developed. But what am I actually contributing to the literature? Firstly, I hope to contribute to the study of the Soviet nationalities more broadly and the role of cultural production, and particularly architecture, in nurturing identity. I also want to disaggregate and decenter architectural history of the Stalin period, revealing it as many separate but interconnected architectural cultures that reflected many different national cultures. And I think this is part of the broader conversation of decolonizing Soviet history, which is often viewed from a very Moscow-centric lens. Certainly true of architectural history. And lastly, going back to the quote on my first slide, I really want to shed light on that question of architectural agency under Stalin. The Soviet Union produced a plethora of really remarkable architectural figures. And in my view, all too often they are just dismissed on the basis that their client was Joseph Stalin. So I think we should challenge that. I'll finish there. I would also just like to thank my supervisors, Mark and Philip Goad, my panel chair, Sarah, all my colleagues in the Soviet history area, and all of you for listening.
Clearly, fantastic questions. Thank you. That was fantastic. I think you can say your contributions will also extend beyond Soviet history. For those of us working on other socialist states like China or Poland and other art forms, these kind of questions also come up about the kind of minority nationalities that national identity is represented. So I think this is a fantastic project. One of the things I wanted to ask about, thinking from at least from what happened in China, is are they setting up architecture academies in various parts of the USSR to cater to training people from minority groups? Like, so sometimes in China they would, set up the Cassie and Design Academy in South Wales would run ethnic minority training class to train to artists.
Yeah.
They do similar.
So I don't know the full extent of it, but I know that in some of the republics, probably particularly where there was a lot of money, like Azerbaijan, there was a lot of money because of the oil. They set up academies and then train local architects. I don't know about some of the Central Asian republics. It's a really good question that I probably need to investigate. There was already in Ukraine and the western reaches of the USSR pretty well established architectural schools and things. But the other thing that was complementing this was these ethnographic academies in Moscow that were trying to, because a lot of these, the process of delimiting the national republics was sort of pseudo-scientifically based, where they'd go, well, what are the different borders, a bit like, what are the different borders in Central Asia and what are the different groups? And then you need to kind of crystallize those groups. So they need a national story, and you have to select the national poet and the hero and all these sort of things. So really it's the communist state. It's quite paradoxical, really. The communist state shepherding these national minorities through what you might call like the bourgeois phase of identity formation in order to reify the internal administrative boundaries of the USSR. Yeah, but it's a really good question. Look at it.
Josh, that was really interesting, and all sorts of weird parallels with Britain and its empire. But I wanted to ask you about how, you're already setting up a bit of a dichotomy between Armenia, the Azeri response to this, and the Uzbek. How does the architecture articulate with other cultural expression? Do you see similar things going on? They're pushing architecture to everything else, but in literature or music, or are there parallels, connections, or is it divergent?
I think the one area that I'm very conscious of is this connection between architecture and epic poetry, which, from my understanding, was something that the Soviets learned about from 19th century national romantic architects. And, in Latvia and in the Baltic republics and even in Germany, there was this, connection between the codification of epic poetry as a sort of touchstone of the new nation. And then this would be represented through statues and murals and all sorts of things in the architecture. I'm not sure about, one of the tenets of socialist realism was that you should really be combining all the plastic arts in buildings in order to tell stories, to turn these buildings into stage sets to tell the national stories. So I think there is a connection there, but it's, again, something to investigate further. Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I was just wanted to say that your research would definitely make a great contribution to the centering of scholarship of lecture and discussions about the colonization of the field. What you also mentioned, but you have not probably chance to articulate more. I was also interested to learn about what you mentioned about architect and client connection between. Maybe you can probably elaborate more on that.
Yeah.
What I was thinking, probably, do you look into the question who was requesting to build this or that building? And so you might look, whether it was central department store, or building built by cooperative store, or it was train station or underground, and whether you're looking at different kind of everyday type of architecture, something related to everyday life of people, and also how this contributed to decentralization of architecture, and also give agency to architects specifically.
Yeah, great question. I think there's, if you would have watched Jonathan Mead's documentary, which I love, by the way, but it's very reductive. It's sort of Stalin is the client, and all the architects are cowed by him, and they just have to guess what he's thinking. Not true. You have hundreds of different commissioning agencies across the USSR. It could be the Ministry of Defence, it could be the trade unions, it could be industry, all sorts of different agencies. And then again, at a local level in the Republic. So, and then the architects themselves. So one of the interesting things I'm trying to explore is the architects who take on often quite powerful positions within bureaucratic institutions and are effectively signing off on their own designs. So they become their own clients, particularly when they're very well known and they're not going to be overridden by some local potentate. So I think that whole dynamic, the way that we think about the patron-client relationship, which is one of the key sort of focus areas in architectural history, needs to be tipped on its head when you're looking at the USSR, because that market-based system of, there's a commissioning patron and then there's a designer, it doesn't work. Architects were part of the state, and the state was everything. So there were all these different agencies that were the state, but then they had different preferences, they had different bosses, they had different regional flavors and all sorts of things. So yeah, that's a big question for my research.
Thanks, Josh. That was so good. I'm wondering how change over time factors into your thesis. And I guess, as we know, if the nationalities policies were relatively progressive in the early 30s, what about when they turn much more oppressive in the late 30s and onwards? How does that affect your story about architecture? And the second question relates to, do you see your thesis being a comparative history? And where does, I guess, the literature on Russian architecture fit into that as well?
Okay. So one of the ways I'm trying to address change over time is by looking at on a regional basis. So the first region I'm looking at is the Caucasus, and the Caucasus had a bit of a head start, particularly because of the factors I described about Armenia. And then in the 1930s, you get this kind of industrialization drive in Central Asia, which kickstarts building there. There's this complex relationship with Ukrainian nationalism and all these sort of factors that means that a different process is happening in the West. And also there's the factor of because of Ukraine being in the pale of settlement, and Jewish architects were so prominent in the pre-war period. After the Second World War, you get a very different composition of architects who are in a lot of respects more willing to go down this path, like ethnic Ukrainian motifs, particularly with the rebuilding of Kyiv and Minsk. But and then finally you've got like the newly incorporated the Baltic republics and Moldova. So I think I'm really interested to explore how, and this is at a time when Stalin's policy is much more imperial. And you've got the Seven Sisters in Moscow, and he's much more interested in these prestige projects. So, you know, for instance, the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw is a replica of one of the Seven Sisters. So I do think it changes over time, and I think probably the state cares less down the track around playing nice with the national minorities because they just don't fear them anymore, I suspect. What was your second question?
Oh, it was just relating to comparative history, and if you see the thesis.
Oh, yeah.
Comparative history.
Yeah. So, I mean, the comparative history, I would love to do a comparative history between National Social, Nazi architecture, Italian architecture, and this, because they're within it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I think that's kind of what I'm doing. Right? I'm trying to tease out the differences between the different republics and why some seem to take to this. Some of them seem to really develop independently their own architectural style, and others had it imposed upon them. And what are the variables that go into that? And I sort of touch on that. So, like, what was the maturity of the profession in each of the republics? What was the level of urbanization? How strong was national sentiment? Did they have an acceptable, ideologically acceptable architectural tradition that they could draw on? So I think I want to get this explanatory model to account for those differences.
We're out of time.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Josh.
So let's hope we're in the issues. God, I've lost mine.
She should be able to share her screen.
Yeah. Dina, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hello, excellent. Can you share your screen? Do you have slides?
Yes. Yes, sir.
You might want to tell her to click, I think swap displays, just because it's the presenter mode.
Dina?
Yeah?
Can you click swap displays? We can get the slides as large as possible. See up on the top, try swap displays. Yep, that's great. That's great.
Perfect.
Okay. So no, where's the mic? Like, is it, how are they going to hear me? Is it through?
Yes, it's muted, so you've got to unmute
For colleagues online, is that easier to hear? Okay. If I can just ask for your attention, our next. I don't know. That's what I'm about to test. Just hold it up. Our next seminar is a completion seminar. It's Dina Hussain, who is in fact joining us from Cairo today. And we're just going to start off by checking our audio. Dina, do you want to say something boldly?
Yes, hello. Good afternoon.
So far we have an issue that Dina is on mute. We'll just solve that.
Yeah, I'm going to agree.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not as a 1 week.
Try speaking again.
Say something else, Dana.
Hello, can you hear me?
And here's the song.
Yes.
Try again.
Hi. Good afternoon. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good.
2 out of the 3. Just
Finding the right one. You want to try one more time?
Yes, hello.
Sorry. Okay, that's
Yep.
coming through.
Yep,
Is it
we're
clear?
hearing you now. That's
I can
Okay.
hear you,
Awesome.
honestly.
okay. And if other audience members, Richard, I'm looking at you, who are joining us online, can mute their computers, that will help. I think everyone else is pretty much muted. It's mute it, Richard. Thank you. It's a really important moment in a PhD candidature to arrive at the completion seminar. It signals that the candidate is approaching the end and that submission will be in the not too distant future. It's also a moment for us as Dina's colleagues and peers, and also for some esteemed guests from further afield. I know we have people joining us from both the United States and other people joining us from Egypt, to celebrate what is a monumental achievement, which is the near completion of a PhD. So a completion seminar, Dina will speak for about 40 minutes about her research that she's conducted, and then we're going to have 20 minutes or so for the opportunity for questions. Hopefully we'll be able to hear our other Zoom guests. Otherwise we will make recourse to me reading out written questions. I think because we're already a little late, I'll hand over to Dina. Dina, the floor is yours. We're really looking forward to this.
Thank you, Zoe, very much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dina Hussein, and today I'm going to talk about my doctoral dissertation titled An Indigenous Working Class History of the Port City of Alexandria, Egypt, 1850 to 1919. And before I speak today of Alexandria's indigenous working class, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, on which you meet, and pay respects to elders past and present. I will begin briefly by introducing the history of this research, what motivated it, what influenced the trajectory it took, and the context in which it was written. I have been thinking about the history of 19th century Alexandria ever since I began my MA in history at Georgetown University in the United States in 2006. I realized that my interest in history was driven by the compulsion to search for my family's Alexandria. Unable to find it in the historical scholarship on Alexandria, I was compelled to write their story into the city's history. But who am I, and what's the story of my family? I spent most of my childhood in the 1980s in my maternal grandparents' apartment overlooking Alexandria's western harbor. My grandparents' balcony looked over the harbor's 10th gate, where commercial passenger ships docked. And every aspect of my family's lived experience has been tied to and colored by the port. This includes where they lived, how they ended up in Alexandria, and what they did for a living. Okay, cannot change the slides. No, it's changing. Okay. My grandparents were cousins. Their great-grandparents were rural migrants from Upper Egypt who had possibly settled in Alexandria in the middle decades of the 19th century to work as dockers at the port. For generations, the working men in my family have predominantly worked at the docks in various capacities, from loading and unloading ships to working in customs authority, shipping companies, and having their freight forwarding businesses. This research, however, is not a family history. This study of the indigenous working class history of Alexandria in the 19th century is nevertheless driven by what Richard Shaw has argued is the compulsion to understand what is at the heart of a new wave of a critical family history. But while engaging critically with one's family's history poses methodological and moral challenges for all historians, Those descending from working class families in the Middle East have a more fundamental obstacle: little or no private paper trail to reference. At best, you would find studio-staged photographs, birth, marriage, and death certificates, and possibly a housing contract. It's improbable to find diaries, letters, and other personal documents that sustain the writing of family history. It's a history that is hardly literate. Stories of struggles are not documented or narrated within working-class families. If they were, they would likely be beautified or partially told. Resorting to the public archives in Egypt is no less of an obstacle. The Egyptian National Archives is a secured fortress, inaccessible, hard to navigate, and not arranged to facilitate the writing of microhistory or family biography of a single working-class family. Nevertheless, the compulsion to write about my family's histories and understand their place in the city has colored all stages of this research. I began working on this dissertation in March 2020 as the COVID-19 pandemic locked down the world. I lived in Melbourne at the time, which was, as you probably know, one of the world's most locked down cities by October 2021. Delayed access to Arabic language sources such as censuses, police, and court records housed at the Egyptian National Archives in Cairo made it necessary for me to commence my research by investigating different types of sources, namely digitized historical photographs. This detour from my initial research plan shaped how I looked at the original handwritten documents later when I finally gained access to conduct a 6-month research at the Cairo-based archives between June and December 2022. The research detour began during lockdown when my supervisor, Richard Pennell, forwarded me a link to some newly digitized photographic albums by the 19th century Beirut-based French studio Maison Bonfils. The British Library's Endangered Archives program funded the digitization of Bonfils' historical photographic albums, which Beirut's political turmoil threatened. The first time I scrolled through these digitized souvenirs from the Orient, looking for Alexandria, I could only see monuments, pillars, obelisks, and other ruins. The images were typical of Orientalist photography, depicting ancient monuments to satisfy what historians of photography have often labeled the European colonial eyes. The landscape images captured in the Bonfils albums were almost void of people. I was lost as how I could use these photographs to write about Alexandria's rural migrants. I looked again and began noticing the cemetery, the photographer captured from the Greco-Roman column. This is a view from the pillar, commonly known as Pompey's Pillar. I remembered my grandmother sitting in her apartment in Al Nasr Road, dressed in black, surrounded by mourners, and wailing in disbelief in the wake of my young cousin's untimely death. In her wailing, she centered the pillar, this space, as a place of coldness and death, the place of the cemetery. I realized then that I had to trust my gaze, shaped by my family's histories and memory. When I looked at the same photograph again, I noticed the houses in the surrounding of the pillar and the cemetery. The ensuing questions about who lived in these houses, where they came from, why they squatted next to the graveyard, and how their mode of settlement shaped the city and influenced their experiences, guided me through this research. However, an overarching question anchored my research. How do we use Orientalist historical photographs capturing Egypt's monuments to write the social history of what I refer to as the indigenous working class? To sum up what I do, or what I did, is to say that this study reconstructs the history of Alexandria's rural migrants, challenging dominant narratives that have framed the 19th century port city as a Europeanized cosmopolitan space. It sets off by engaging with the conventions of digital archiving as played out in the British Library's Bonfils de Bass photographic collection to understand the opportunities and challenges that the current surge in digitization bestows on the writing of subaltern working-class indigenous history. It looks at how revisionist historians can read Alexandria's digitized 19th century Orientalist historical photographs capturing ancient monuments to write the indigenous history of the local population. Additionally, it digs deeply into a few archival files, census and police records, as well as correspondence between the government bureaus in the period roughly between 1850 and 1919, to put people's history back into the photograph and understand the lives of the indigenous working class, migrants from the hinterland, the Aghrab, or the outsiders, as the official records often refer to them, who have historically been marginalized by studies of Alexandria. Yet, it does not only offer a historical revision, it also provides a long-term historical perspective on current debates on urban inequality, forced displacement, and gentrification. By centering the experience of indigenous rural migrants in the 19th century, it contributes to theoretical debates on urbicide, the death of the city. It builds on studies that understand urbicide not solely as physical military destruction of the city, but as a graduate, slow process of modern and colonial urban planning that excludes, controls, and monitors the indigenous population. It shows how 19th century colonial governance used urban planning as a tool of exercising spatial violence against the indigenous population. It shed light on how policing, census documentation, housing demolitions, and burial ground relocations were used to exclude and marginalize the Aghrab, who were the majority of the city's population throughout the 19th century. It begins by investigating the Bonfi photographs capturing the Greco-Roman pillar and its vicinity, the space where many rural migrants first settled. For my visual methodology, however, I borrow the central approach of microhistory to read the Bonfi photographs by undertaking what Esteban Sijarto has called the intensive historical investigation of a relatively well-defined small object, in this case, the photograph. In place of long-durée history writing that has investigated change over a long period of time, microhistorians have centered their work on a focal point, quote, collecting different rays coming from the past, which lends itself a real force. In the Maison Bonfi photographs, the focal point that motivated the photographer to capture the image was, more often than not, a monument. In the case of 19th century Alexandria specifically, the pillar attracted the pillar in the city's southwest attracted the photographer's eyes, as well as the European tourist and the archaeologist as well. In other words, I used the pillar and its environment captured in the photographs as my focal point to revise the history of the city. Yeah, so this is the pillar that you see in the background of the photograph here. And this is taken from the Western Harbor. So this is from the sea looking in. And this is also the cover of the albums of the Bonfi historical photographic collection. Moving on to, I begin with what Ronnie Close has highlighted as a methodology of reading images through decoloniality, to yield new insights to the viewer. Following this methodology, the historian reading the image, in this case myself, is an active viewer or consumer. My insights as an active viewer of the Bonfi photography of Alexandria are informed and shaped by a memory of my grandmother that I shared with you, which informed also how I see the photographs of the pillar, not as a visual archive capturing the Greco-Roman monument, but as a place of life and death for rural migrants of Alexandria. Quoting cultural theorist Rose states, what is important about images is not simply the image itself, but how it is seen by particular spectators who look in particular ways. I read the photographs as I see them to tell the history of Alexandria as seen and lived by my subjects. At the heart, this is at the heart of the spirit of microhistory. To undertake this intensive historical investigation of the small object, the photograph, and the place it captured, I read deeply into a few archival files, census and police records, as well as correspondence between the government bureau. For reasons related to time constraints and other research limitations that I encountered at the Egyptian National Archives, I could only collect fragments of the historical records from this period and place. Yet again, microhistory has provided me with a way to approach these fragments from the past. As Sigurður Magnusson has explained, the premise of microhistorical research is not a matter of as not a matter of recreating the reality of past times, but of examining the fragments of realities we have with all their limitations. To utilize these fragments, the historians, as Magnuson has described, must explicate their sources and allow the reader to join this research quest by identifying how they found and read their sources while identifying the gaps that exist in knowledge of the subject. This is what I will try to do. By utilizing this microhistorical approach, I read conventional sources in a different way, by slowing down my research to read deeply into the fragments of historical records and understand the circumstances of people previously not admitted into the historian's research. But before I go into the details of the sources, I would like to explain a little bit my use of indigenous in the context of Egypt, which is not usual. The use of indigenous is debatable in the Egyptian context due to the country's long history of intercultural and interethnic migration and settlement. I use indigenous to describe historically rooted inhabitants of the Nile Valley and Delta, particularly rural migrants who made up Alexandria's local working class communities in the 19th century. Research scholarships have indeed expanded the use of the term beyond ethnicity. The term indigenous is useful in differentiating rural migrants from the port cities, mostly European foreign residents who enjoyed varying degrees of privileged rights under colonial rule and the associated urban regime. Even if Egypt was not a settler colony, I argue that rural migrants experienced systematic modes of dispossession, exclusion, and marginalization in 19th century Alexandria. Indigeneity in this context provides a valuable analytical category that helps us discuss spatial exclusion and resistance. As this study demonstrates, Alexandria's indigenous rural migrants both localized indigenous way of inhabiting space to the city, such as mud brick housing structures, aishash, burial traditions related to neighboring the dead, jiwar, and others that mirrored rural village life. They, in return, faced displacement, dispossession, expulsion by the colonial and semi-colonial administration governing the city under the pretext of cleansing and Europeanizing the city. By adopting an indigeneity framework, this research provides a decolonial lens through which to understand historical erasure, marginalization, and resistance of Alexandria's working class Aghrab or migrants. Now I will spend a couple of minutes talking about the theory of herbicide and how it relates to my research. There's a present-day concern with deconstructing the common understanding of urban development as a growth-oriented paradigm to focus instead on reducing inequalities omnipresent in colonial cities and promoting good living. The death of the city, herbicide, is understood as the loss of quality of life due to exclusion and expulsion in cities. The city was, after all, initially created by political communities to live well. This death has a history and often dates back to the 19th century and to 19th century colonialism, the Belle Epoque of modern economic imperialism. In this era, global port cities like Alexandria rapidly grew through migration patterns from the hinterland, populating and building a metropolis that facilitated the export of raw commodities to the metropole. But before engaging with its death, it's worth expanding on the meaning of the city as defined by Fernando Carrion Mona and Paulina Pico in their recently edited book on herbicide. The city is a social construction, I'm quoting them, born from the societal nexus that comes from conjugal life, home, domestic space, house, village dynamics, community, and citizen formation, public spaces under a specific purpose, to live well. Building on this definition, the city dies if living well is not achieved or is only attainable for a privileged few. Revisionist historians have recently explored urban coloniality from global south perspectives by challenging traditional urban planning paradigms, emphasizing how European colonialism fueled the inequalities embedded in the cities of the global south today. Urban scholars prioritizing the global south perspective and experiences such as Ananya Roy challenged the rigid dichotomy between formal and informal urban spaces, highlighting how the latter, informality, was integral to the functioning of the city. Like in many other colonial cities, colonial governance attempted to erase or control indigenous ways of life, including mud brick dwellings, aishash, that Alexandria's governing regime considered to be the hallmark of informality. Writing against social and spatial exclusion of Alexandria's indigenous working class, this study centers life in the aishash, in the mud brick homes, which are visible in the background of Bonfi's photographs capturing the view from the pillar. Here they're in the foreground. Influenced by the theory of herbicide, this dissertation explores how the microhistory of a view from the pillar in Alexandria, captured by a photograph, can revise our understanding of the colonial city and historicizes its death. It asks if rural migrants that made up the city's majority lived well. Did colonialism ever create a city where the indigenous population lived well? Or is a colonial city born dead, a miscarriage of sorts? I argue that the reason the city of my ancestors was not present in the mainstream narrative of Alexandria has to do with the fact that it symbolized how a colonial city was born dead. In its urban stillbirth, the modern colonial state excluded rural migrants as outsiders and removed them from view, both in photographs and reality. It policed, profiled, controlled them, and cracked down on their wandering to impose an exclusive urban order. However, the rural migrants' imprints they left on the city are evident in the material culture of their domestic spaces, the aishash, and the conjugal memories of their grandchildren endured to tell their story. Now I will give you an overview of my chapters. The first chapter searches for the indigenous working class in the historiography of modern Alexandria. It shows how revisionist historians have not, despite their efforts to depart from the Orientalist narrative of the city, focused on the lived experience and geographical spaces of the port city's indigenous population in their accounts of Alexandria. This, I argue, is because two reasons actually caused this. The first is historians focus on grand narratives, and the second is the dearth of archival material capturing the voice of the indigenous working class. On grand narratives, I argue that the exclusion of rural migrants from the mainstream history of Alexandria results from what Magnuson has described as historians' preoccupation with grand narratives and their dependence on colonial records, where the indigenous subaltern voice is hardly detectable. The preoccupation with grand historical questions, such as cosmopolitanism, and grand theories, such as the rise of global nationality and labor movements and imperial identities, has led historians to reproduce Eurocentric histories of the city and omit the stories of indigenous rural migrants to a great extent and to varying degrees, of course. In contrast to these studies, Magnuson urges historians to ignore the grand narrative and focus instead on the research method he calls the singularization of history. This is perhaps the most critical strike back at Eurocentric scholarship that has dominated the writing of the history of the Middle East and Egypt. In other words, this approach permits historians to write about any group of people or things previously marginalized or removed from view without needing to append them to a grand narrative. It's possible, I argue, that zooming out too far to grasp a grand narrative or capture a grand monument is what makes some people and stories vanish. But there's also the so-called cultural turn in history writing that influenced studies of Alexandria. A preoccupation with questions of modernity and identity that made historians, as Kevin Jones tells us, abandon the search for the hidden voices of workers, especially so in the Middle East, where the archives are notoriously difficult to access, and the pervasive illiteracy of the working class makes it difficult for researchers to find their voices in historical documents. In contrast to this trend in the historiography of Alexandria and the Middle East more broadly, my study focuses on the stories of life and death inside the ramshackle homes, the aishash of the indigenous rural migrants, to expose aspects of this violence and infiltration of their private abodes and lives. I do so by using textual fragments I find in the archives, such as those written on the margin of census registers, giving me clues that the mud brick homes we see in this Bonfi photo, not this one, the previous one, fragments that I find in archives, such as those written on the margins of census registers, giving me clues that the mud brick homes we see in this Bonfi photo were built for soldiers, artillerymen, the Tubjiya, that the relatives lived there. That are also traces that tell me that the type of building the indigenous rural migrants occupied were mud brick homes, built with materials from the Egyptian hinterland. Some of these fragments also include a signature exposing who the census scribe was, where he lived, who he lived with. In other words, I assemble a plethora of little evidence to understand the lived experience of the indigenous working class and the kind of life they lived. This assemblage of evidence, quoting E.L. Wiseman as he explains the field of forensic architecture he founded, might also include a memory that helps you reconstruct space. In chapter 2, I interrogate the Debas Bonfi photographic albums that the British Library has digitized to ask, does digitization democratize the photographic archive? I analyze how the digitization wave sweeping the humanities can contribute to more democratic access to sources that facilitate history writing, specifically indigenous history. On a basic level, digitization facilitates the dissemination of historical photographic images. When published on websites, the historical images can be easily accessible for sharing and wide circulation. This mode of sharing and dissemination allows for a wide array of cultural reworking of the images, be it to produce a nostalgic, ahistorical imagining of the past, anti-colonial activism, and everything in between. But while the digital turn has made historical photographs accessible, the new kinds of cultural usage that surface are not necessarily representative of the people's history, egalitarian or democratic. This begs the question of what it means to truly democratize the photographic archive in an increasingly digital world. As Jane Lydon portrays in her research on Australia, democratization is an action by the historically dispossessed to take back agency and control of their image by decapturing it from the colonial gaze. I argue that such a radical and profound democratization of the photographic archive is only achievable by exposing rather than erasing history, that which was omitted at the moment of dissemination and display, and the moment the colonial camera first captured the image. In other words, to decapture the image from the colonial gaze, we need to put history back into it. This is what I try to do in the research. I first went searching for the mud brick homes I see in this photograph. I encountered the Tubjiya dwellings for a second time after seeing them in the photographs in the late 19th century excavation reports of the Pillar Plateau. Successive European, primarily Italian, classicist archaeologists described these aishash, these mud brick homes, as the main hurdle to the success of their dig seasons. The archaeologist goal, was to unearth the extant underground chambers of the Greco-Roman Serapeum temple underneath these houses. Archaeologists and elite members of the Alexandria municipality in the late 19th century, called for the mud brick homes, for the demolition of the mud brick homes and the cemetery and the relocation of the cemetery to make way for the excavation of the subterranean gallery of the Greco-Roman Serapeum temple. The aishash in the vicinity of the pillar became a problem for the colonial and the semi-colonial administration. First, for the city's planners wishing to sanitize the space for archaeological digs and tourism, and later for public health officials under the pretext of fighting pandemics. But first, let's examine who specifically occupied these aishash. In chapter 3, this is the census registry, one of the pages of the census registries in the National Archives, documenting the occupants of this neighborhood of the pillar. In chapter 3, I used the census records of 1846 and 1868 at the Egyptian National Archives to populate the houses I traced in the previous chapter. Against the preoccupation of demographic studies with the numerical data of census records, I read the census as an image of people and place. I trace visual, like I said, written clues in the registers to find details of life in these mud brick homes. I also used the registers, focusing specifically on the Pillar West Side, to understand where the inhabitants came from and what they did for a living. I thus unveil a neighborhood of rural migrants who migrated from the Egyptian hinterland to work in hard manual labor, creating a waterfront engulfed between the Western Harbor and the Mahmoudiyya Canal in the south. They lived in traditional houses made of mud brick and thatch on the banks of the Nile Water Canal, which was the Mahmoudiyya Canal in the 19th century. Muhammad Ali Pasha, the ruler of Egypt, until the 1830s, ordered the canal to be dug using corvée labor, really, and rural migrants also dug the canal. So the canal runs south of the city, and the Western Harbor is to the west, and basically the Pillar area is really engulfed between the Nile Water Canal and the Western Harbor. I found out from the margins of the census register that these mud brick dwellings had been constructed initially as army barracks for housing artillerymen, literally al-tubjiyah. By 1847, the census takers identified the occupants of these aishas as the relatives of soldiers serving in an artillery mission unit outpost. Following Muhammad Ali Pasha's enumeration orders, soldiers dwelling in the aishash and big cities were to be counted by the War Ministry, independent from the general census. In this civilian census registry that I consulted, the census taker listed only a few discharged soldiers. The rest of the Tubjiyah occupants were relatives of serving soldiers. Like the broader neighborhood, the dwellings primarily housed rural migrants from the hinterland arriving in the city from villages along the Nile Delta and Upper Egypt. The register enumerated 196 individuals housed in the Tubjiyah dwellings, 97 males and 99 females. To understand the lived experience of these individuals neighboring the pillar, we need to resketch their living quarters. The first step is to understand the physical characteristics of their abodes. What type of dwelling did they live in? How were they built, and by whose hand? The census takers provided minimal, often inconsistent information on dwelling types. In the registers covering Alexandria's zone, the zone of the pillar in 1847, the scribes often used maskan or manzil, both general terms for a house, or aisha, plural aishash, to refer to the dwelling type of the enumerated abode. In the case of collective dwellings, such as tenements, the census takers identified the dwelling type as a room, oda. They sometimes noted the tenure type, specifically when a household had owned the property. But the census taxonomy provided little clues about the physical structure of each dwelling, leaving a significant gap in our understanding of what kind of dwelling Aisha was in the middle decades of the 19th century and how it differed from a house. As the name suggests, the Tubjiyah dwelling, also called Aishash al-Bulukat, possibly derived from the military term blockhouse, were grouped in blocks corresponding to military units. The census takers did not enumerate the Tubjiyah dwellings household by household, which was really how they enumerated the rest of the city. They made separate lists of the males and the females living within each of these blocks of Aishash. For everyone listed as per the register's general format, the census taker documented the person's information and relationship to the soldier associated with the dwelling. Despite the listing system that broke away from the household by household census taking method, the Tubjiyah dwellings were occupied mainly by families. A wide array of family members, spouses, siblings, children, parents, in-laws, and cousins of soldiers left their villages in the rural hinterland and followed those artillerymen to Alexandria. There were various reasons behind this mode of forced migration related to agrarian reforms at the time that caused hardships for the rural communities and agricultural laborers. But how could soldier encampments accommodate migrant families? One episode in the history of suffering of the indigenous population under Muhammad Ali's reign was the construction of army barracks. The chronicles of the renowned Egyptian historian Abdurrahman al-Jabarti, who lived between 1753 and 1825, provide important insight into the history of housing, including the making of military barracks under Muhammad Ali. In his account of 1815, al-Jabarti highlighted that Muhammad Ali ordered peasants across the province to make mud brick to construct army barracks and ship them to Alexandria and other stations. In addition to mud bricks, the Pasha ordered village chiefs to provide thatch and fronds from date palm trees as supporting building materials. He also commanded the village chief to recruit men to transport the materials and build the ishash. Even if they were built in a rush with thatched roofing, the Tubjiya dwellings were still rural mud brick houses built using traditional agricultural building materials. This fact is crucial in picturing the built environment that surrounded the pillar. It indicates how rural migrants arriving in Alexandria in the 19th century lived in neighborhoods that shared some of the rural characteristics of their villages, most especially apparent in the type of dwelling that housed them. The existence of the village in the city was a reality of 19th century Alexandria, yet Alexandria's rurality has been sidelined by the corpus of literature on the city that perceives it as a model Mediterranean cosmopolitan port city with a predominant urban European character. The Tubjiya dwellings were not the only mud brick houses in Alexandria that were built for soldiers and occupied by their relatives. The Egyptian National Archives folder of Ta'dad al-Nufuz, the population census, has a separate register for the Aishash dwellings, Ta'dad al-Aishash. Enumerated in 1847, around 1 year before the census registers of 1848, the general census. These registers listed individuals living in Aisha's dwelling throughout Alexandria and not only in the pillar area. By looking at the census, the census revealed a migrant community of unskilled wage laborers who left their villages to carry grain, cotton, and the building blocks that made Alexandria a great port city. Their back-breaking labor as porters, stevedores, and builders formed the Alexandrian waterfront. The rural migrants were undoubtedly the backbone of this modern port city's trade booms in the 19th century. While they built a metropolis, tens of thousands of men, women, and children from the hinterland lived in mud hovels and ramshackle houses on the fringes, creating a waterfront rooted in rural life engulfed between the canal and the sea, as I said. Through the census registers, I populated the Pillar West Side and resketched the shape of life in this area. I did so while recognizing how the image of people and place conceals as much as it reveals. The census are almost silent on women. Even if their names, ages, and occupations were often missing, in the census registers, we still saw women and girls on the pages of the registers. Some migrated with their families to live in ramshackle dwellings. Others followed a dispatched soldier, a husband, a son, or a brother to the city, settling in these mud brick barracks. Some women lived alone, often with a child or more, or in a female household. Widows and other single mothers lived in government rooms for the very poor and received welfare payments. In contrast to the census registers, however, women's voices and stories are more audible in police records. In the following chapter, I simultaneously expand and narrow the view from the pillar. I do so by entering the Aishash through the police record to further understand the lived experience of its inhabitants in their private lives. Considering everyday practices and exceptional situations that people experience inside their bodies, in their homes and backyards, the view narrows in focus but expands in impact. In Chapter 4, I entered the Aishash through the police records to further understand the lived experience of its inhabitants, particularly women who were escorted to the police by the neighborhood chiefs for a myriad of reasons. All had to do with controlling their behaviors and bodies. I argue that the principle, by looking at the police registers and specifically cases involving people who lived in mud brick homes specifically in the Pillar area or the southwest of Alexandria, I argue that the principal motive of policing Alexandria during this period was to crack down on wandering. This was part of a broader effort to gentrify the city, a process that manifested itself as clearing out of the wanderers and the unwanted, the unemployed, people fleeing enslavement, children playing in the street, and quote-unquote suspicious women. The profiling, expulsion, and exclusion of rural migrants from the city was an everyday affair by the police system. And it's also evidence of the everyday urban violence endured by the indigenous population under the colonial and the quasi-colonial administration of the port city. Chapter 4 also showcases how women's bodies were at the heart of the state's frenzy of control and violence. To showcase this point, I highlight how the state dealt with miscarriages to control life and death in the city. I can, in the discussion, explain a little bit more about this. In the final chapter, however, I return to the cemetery of the Pillar, which Studio Maison Bonfils captured in the photographic albums. I traced the official correspondence between the Alexandria governor, the Ministry of Interior, and the public health and the administration to showcase how controlling death and burial grounds were central administration topics in the 19th century. I focus mainly on the tension between the indigenous population, the local governor, and the colonial public health officials around the question of moving the Muslim cemetery of the Pillar. Remember, I mentioned that the municipality and prominent archaeologists of the city wanted to move the to the cemetery for reasons that have to do with sanitizing the space and transforming this land into a touristic site, but also later the pretext of wanting to move the cemetery and relocate it was one of public health, because the houses the public health administration stated was really crowding or very, very close to the cemetery. And there was an attempt then to kind of differentiate or separate places of living and places of death. So I focus mainly in this chapter on the tension between the indigenous population, the local governor, and the colonial public health officials around the question of moving the Muslim cemetery of the Pillar. In doing so, I unveil a history of endurance. I show how and why the cemetery remained in its place. It still exists today. It's still in its place today, the Pillar Cemetery, despite voracious attempts to gentrify the land and displace the indigenous dead. Regarding Egyptian urban cemetery spaces, including the Pillar graveyard, it's hard to delineate what came first. Were they places of residence dotted by tombstones or a cemetery space crowded by Aishash? The best way to see these spaces is through the prism of what Peter Johnson has called the spatial intimacy between the dead and the living. In Europe, this intimacy that peaked in medieval times came to an end in the late 18th century when the modern state perceived the accumulation of corpses in churchyards, the customary burial grounds, as a public health threat. In 19th century Egypt, a similar process occurred as the modern state attempted to distance the cemetery from the city, separate the living from the dead, and end the fluidity of urban spaces that housed both simultaneously. Returning to the debates on herbicides, I show in this chapter how the modern state attempt to distance the urban cemetery from the living is a form of social dissolution, destruction, and death of the city that had endured from the 19th century to the present. By its desire to destroy the urban cemetery, the state was breaking an important indigenous practice, namely neighboring the dead, or jiwar, which meant living close to the cemetery, which it was a custom where people would live close to the cemetery in order to care for the deceased loved ones as if they were alive. And all this was part of an enduring practice of ziyara, or tomb visitations, that people continue to do in the context of urban cemeteries to this day. And I can also talk a little bit more about this in the discussion. In conclusion, This study offers a new way of reconstructing indigenous history from Orientalist photography, originally meant to document monuments while removing locals from view, a method of decolonizing urban history that can be applied beyond Alexandria. It also contributes to theoretical debates on urbicide by showing how colonial urban violence in a non-settler colony took the shape of gradual administrative destruction of indigenous life through policing, expulsion, housing demolitions, and burial relocations. Thank you. I went over time, did I?
Dina, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Just trying to view all participants. We now have 15, 20 minutes for questions. Hopefully there'll be some from guests on Zoom as well as some in the room. If you have a question and you're on Zoom, perhaps you could try and raise your hand or wave at me. Similarly, if you have, we might take a question here first. Andy, I'll bring you.
Great, can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. Congratulations, Dina. It's a wonderful achievement to get to this point, particularly with the origins of your work in the pandemic. And I think it was, a very intellectually creative sort of course that you were sort of forced to take that sort of resulted in this really, really intriguing approach. And I guess my question is really, it might be a bit of a Dorothy Dixer in a way, but I mean, your focus is on Indigenous working class migrants. And I guess by virtue of the fact that you had to give us a kind of a macro summary of your argument and your themes. But with your focus on lived experience, we didn't actually hear the name of one migrant or a particular story or vignette that you think might best exemplify some of the core themes. So can you maybe, in a nutshell, give us an example at the sort of micro level that helps us to sort of reflect on the kind of aggregate conclusions that you've come to?
Yes, thank you very much, Andy. Yes, I didn't. So specifically in the the way I approach microhistory is really, all of my chapters, they lead with stories of people, of rural migrants, including, for instance, the chapter on the census. I lead by the story of the census scribe. His name is Ahmed Ali. He lived in the neighborhood or the district that he enumerated. He came from Cairo, but he lived with other rural migrants in one of these mud brick homes. And he worked basically with the neighborhood chief in order to enumerate their own neighborhood, not neighborhood in the bigger sense, but couple of streets or zones of their neighborhood. But also the stories are much more kind of detailed in the police registries, and this idea of the crackdown on wandering really is all about, or kind of is solidified in the stories of women. So one of the important stories that of the time is the story of Sabteya. Sabteya is also a rural migrant who lives in one of these mud brick homes, who was escorted by the neighborhood chief, Sheikh Al-Hara, because she had a miscarriage. This was a time really when the government was cracking down on intramural burials, so burials outside of the official cemetery, and also was controlling women's bodies and counting birth and death. And in a neighborhood like the Pillar and other kind of, settlements really of these mud brick homes, who would know if a woman was pregnant, who would know if she gave birth, who would know if she had a miscarriage. It was really, women and their bodies were really monitored to the extent that Sabteya was escorted to the police station because she had a miscarriage and buried it under the floor of her mud brick home, of her Aisha. And when she went to the police, and basically she was escorted there because she had buried the stillbirth without a proper burial certificate or permit. And when she went to the police, she told them, I thought nothing of it. It was just a cluster of blood, right? And I think this is one of the stories that solidifies the amount of control and invasion really that was happening at the time, that a woman would go to the police because she had a miscarriage and it was almost 3 months. It wasn't really a proper fetus of anything of the sort. So stories like this, stories of women who were escorted because they were considered suspicious, right? Because the whole idea of the crackdown on wandering really started with women, because crackdown on wandering in Arabic meaning, دايرين على هواهم, or, doing whatever they want, was basically a cause for arresting women and expelling them back to the hinterland. And these forms of expulsions were happening every day in the police records. So in terms of microhistory and people's stories, all the chapters kind of, open with these types of stories to kind of reflect or to make the argument of what kind of lived experience and what kind of violence they endured in Alexandria. I hope I answered the question.
Thank you. Have we got further questions, either from those joining us online? Omar, please unmute yourself and let's hope we can hear you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, Dina, for inviting me to join today. I want to just start by also congratulating you, and I want to highlight that what I found most compelling about what I read and heard from you now is the way that you arranged your chapters, the way that you forged a topic that actually fits together in a way that made, to me, a lot of sense. I want to ask a question by way of clarifying. When I read Indigenous and Working Class, you answered one half of the first question that came to my mind, which is why that framework of indigeneity in the first place. But the other thing that I want to ask you about now is when I read Indigenous and Working Class, I'm thinking what you're writing in opposition to. And there were sometimes, as you spoke, I was wondering, is this a story of the modern state and its subjects? Is it a story of rich versus poor, powerful versus, subaltern, etc.? And I wonder the extent to which that indigenous dimension is actually present and deserves this kind of highlighting. Because the only Egyptians who appear in your story are a particular, and you say this is the majority, this is what makes up the city, and so on. But I wonder if this is what makes that subject stand out. If there's something that kind of separates that indigenous working class from other indigenous non-working class, or
Thank you very much, Omar. Well, I thought a lot about your question really, and when I started working on this research, I wasn't, because as I said, most historians of Egypt would somehow, debate the use of indigenous, and because it is a non-settler colony, and because of the heterogeneity of the place, it's unusual. It is unusual to identify a group of people as necessarily indigenous. But again, my use of indigeneity goes beyond this idea of ethnicity, but it also made sense because a lot of the methodology I used was stemmed from or originated from historians and theorists who were interested in writing against colonial, specifically the photographs, colonial archives by seeing how indigenous people who were portrayed, often portrayed in these photographs as absent. They were completely erased from view, or as ethnic types, and so on. So how they could use these photographs to say we exist, and this is our history, and we are claiming it back. So in that sense, I was kind of alerted. The work of Jane Leiden, as I said, on democratizing the archive and decolonizing it is part of this pattern. But also, a lot of the documents I found, the municipality documents and other official documents, they often refer to rural migrants as indigenous. So it's a term that the colonial administration also, and Alexandria, as you know, is like, is it a colonial system? Is it a quasi-colonial system? Is it the modern state? And all of these, it was a complex system of governance where you had the local governor who was often in part of the indigenous elite, if you will. You had the public health administration in Cairo, either French or British, and you had a municipality that was basically formed by European merchants and powerful men in the city, and also indigenous elite. So my use of indigenous was intentional in the sense that I wanted to kind of, claim this and act with it against this kind of, attempt of colonial erasure, whether in the photograph or in studies of the history of the city, and so on. And so I used it intentionally in that sense. And really, I also realized that, even though these rural migrants were not ethnically homogeneous in any way, but they still were extremely rooted in the life or village life on the Nile, in the Delta, and in Upper Egypt. And they brought this way of life with them to Alexandria. And this kind of, rural and indigenous way of living, including, constructing mud brick houses, including burial practices and all of that, that came from the hinterland, that came from the Egyptian hinterland, and was practiced in the city, was also often excluded, because Alexandria in the main narrative is Mediterranean and cosmopolitan and, linked more to Europe than the hinterland. So also my use of indigeneity and the indigenous and classification also comes from this, to link Alexandria to the hinterland. Both, like the canal linked it physically, but also with the population there, to have their Alexandria look more like an Egyptian village than it is like a cosmopolitan urban setting in that sense.
I think maybe the battery is dead.
Can you still hear me, Dana?
Yes, I can hear.
Okay. We have got time for a couple more questions.
I actually had a question.
Leva has a question. Shout at the screen.
Yeah, I realize that you're over there, the camera is over there. Hi, Dina, I'm Leva. I'm in Greek archaeology. And at one point we were in touch for you to come and give a talk about Alexandria, which in the end did not happen because of practicalities.
Yes.
Thank you so much. It was a very, very interesting talk. And I actually have two questions. The first one is related to the link between archaeology and colonialism. So I was fascinating to hear your story about the archaeologists trying to eradicate the indigenous population, as you call them. And we see similar things happening in Athens, actually, where a working class neighborhood is essentially erased to make room for the excavations of the Athenian Agora. And in the 1930s, Mussolini, of course, famously cleaned up Rome with the excuse of improving the health conditions of the working population living in these areas. So in essence, I would say that this phenomenon is not specifically colonial as it is part of nation building. So my question is there anything in the discourse that makes you define it as a specifically colonial phenomenon, or is it a national phenomenon? For example, do you see similar things happening with excavation of Egyptian sites, or is it specifically related to digging up the Greco-Roman past and, of course, link with Europe? And then my second question is related to that. I was, let's say, pleasantly surprised to hear that actually the protest must have been successful, given that at least the burial ground remained in place. So I'm interested to learn more about what kind of protests were staged to keep at least the burial ground in place, given that in other cities like Athens and Rome, protests against the excavations were unsuccessful.
Yeah, thank you very much. Okay, first on the question of archaeology, like colonial versus nation building. I think one of the most important, how I look at it is, with urban development or within the context of urban history and urban studies, is that a lot of the problems and the violence that were persisted in specifically the global South or cities of the global South were extremely rooted in the colonial context. So even if Muhammad Ali, who was the governor of ruler of Egypt, really, and the maker of what we call the modern nation state in the early 19th century, was the one ordering the census, was the one implementing or creating this modern policing system. But he was doing it in a colonial context to make Alexandria, become this kind of, mega port city that would facilitate the export of Egypt's raw materials and grain to Europe, and to kind of, facilitate this kind of relationship of dependency between the metropole and the colony. So even if it was specifically in the case of Egypt and other places of the global South and cities of the global South, the colonial legacy was and continues to be very present in creating these cities with kind of, rampant inequalities and dependencies and exclusions and so on and so forth. So of course, even though the moment was a moment of modern nation building, but it happened under a very heavy kind of, colonial context. And really a lot of the problems that our cities are facing today are rooted in this historical moment, especially in, even in Alexandria, even though the cemetery, and I'm going to speak about how it remained, even though the cemetery continues to exist, but the pillar area is a place of exclusion. You have the Serapeum temple and the pillar itself walled off from the surrounding neighborhood, which is a very kind of, working class neighborhood. So it's kind of a place of, that has an identity crisis. It's a place that's walled, and this idea of walling off the space kind of exemplifies the problem, and it speaks to a lot of this urban violence that even urban, I'm fascinated these days with the work of E.L. Wiseman and the forensic architecture, and he talks about how the cities are kind of dissected of places where specifically, of course, in Palestine, it's the worst case scenario of violence, but this violence is mirrored to varying degrees in colonial cities as well. So you have the walling off. These places, the indigenous population shouldn't go there. These places, the working class shouldn't go there. These are the sanitized neighborhoods. And all of this is happening in a very, very small space. So I don't know how much I answered the question, but it also speaks to Omar's question. Even if it was an exercise in modern nation building, it was still pretty colonial. Even in post-independence cities, in former colonies, formerly colonized cities, the colonial legacy weighs heavily on people's life and how well they're living, and so on and so forth. How did the cemetery survive? Well, I did not find in the archives any, very straightforward evidence of protest. But what I found was a lot of back and forth between the governor of Alexandria and the public health administration in Cairo around moving the cemetery. And the governor of Alexandria explicitly says, in one of his letters that I opened the final chapter 5 with, that he cannot move the cemetery, even though he had been ordered to find this new plot of land next to the Max quarries in the west, outside of the city. He told the public health administration that he cannot approve the relocation of the cemetery because the people would object to it, that it would cause them hardship, that they are so tied to their to the cemetery, so his words kind of reflected the sentiment and also the practice in kind of Islamic culture of this idea of the jiwar meaning to neighbor the dead. It initially starts with this idea that you have to have good neighbors in life and in death, and people started, in Alexandria prior to the 19th century, burying their dead next to shrines of Sufis, of righteous religious kind of figures. And Alexandria prior to the 19th century was dotted with tombstones throughout, and then just like, clusters of tombstones next to shrines. But this principle does not only apply to burial next to shrines. It also applies to, this idea of the jiwar or neighboring the dead applies to people wanting to bury their loved ones close by so that they can visit them and that they could care for them as if they were alive. And there is historical treaties and documents that speak specifically to this and to this practice, that to talk to the dead as if they were listening, to face them and to care for them in a way that, as if they were living. So in order to do this, people really, and continue to this day in certain aspects, want to be living close to the cemetery, keeping the cemetery close by, visiting it regularly. There's even kind of visitation treaties and, codes of proper behavior when you visit, how often you visit, what do you do when you visit, and all of that continue even to this day in some aspect. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Even though we don't have, I couldn't find any kind of, a record of a protest, but I found the reflection of people's objection in the governor's letters.
Thank you, Dina. We have time for one more question. Michael has had his hand raised. So if you want to unmute, Michael, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Dina. I enjoyed listening to your summary of your thesis. I enjoyed reading some sections of it. And one thing that I found particularly satisfying is that when I wrote about Alexandria myself, I always felt that I was not able to penetrate somehow to the interior history of the city. Partly because we're rather primitive, but also because I think I lacked the imagination that was required in order to tell the story from an inside perspective. So bravo. I appreciated very much that aspect and learned a great deal about Alexandria's history from you. And I also appreciate the micro-historical perspective very much. There's a couple of things I want to, a couple of questions I'll raise. They're more impressionistic, and I don't know that you can give specific answers to them, but maybe you can. One of them has to do with the literature. I would like to have your comments on Robert Hilbert's work. A number of people have written about Alexandria, but nobody's written more than Robert Hilbert. So I think it is important to have, put your work into conversation with his monumental work on Alexandria. So that's one question. I see that you're writing from very different perspectives, but nevertheless, I would like to hear your thoughts there. Amongst the other things I wanted to say, two things. One is I love your handling of your documents, and in reading the photographic archive, the census records, the police records, bringing El Jabarti in. All of these are really important contributions. I'm not convinced about this herbicide thesis. All right. It doesn't make sense to me. Maybe I'm lacking in imagination. Okay. It reifies the city, it seems to me, in a way that I'm not convinced is the way people actually experience it. And I'll add one thing to it, just again, maybe, for you to think about. It may be necessary sometimes to disengage from the grand narrative. And I do see your writing in a sort of as a species of postmodern historiography. But in my experience, and I think that you can find lots of evidence for this, people want to belong to a grand narrative. So in a way, I think that even people whose lives are, you might say, made more difficult by other people who are engaging in a grand narrative, I still see that people want the grand narrative. Even people who are marginalized by it want it. They want it. They enjoy it. They feel somehow exalted by it. So if you want to comment on that, that's probably more than enough. I've written a whole bunch of other things and I can email them to you. But if you want to comment on those things, that would be very helpful.
Thank you very much, Mike. I learned a lot actually from your work, and also Mike Reimer helped me a lot when I was attempting to enter the archives and work on the census, because he did the major kind of study on the census of Alexandria. So herbicide. Of course, people wanted to, so how I started this research really, and for the past, the majority of the time I spent working on it for 3 or 4 years, I was completely focused on the microhistorical perspective. I looked at and it was one of the kind of comments that I often got from my committee in the progress review milestones, is that I'm so focused on looking on the sources, digging into the sources, and not looking more broadly about or engaging more broadly with theories of urban colonialism and urban coloniality and all of that. So my starting point was, when I looked at the census, I didn't know what I was looking for, apart from that I knew that there was a geographical location and space and time that I was focused on. And I then extracted and let the sources themselves tell me, the bigger story that I wanted to kind of, engage with. So it's only recently that I kind of, started thinking of this whole theory of herbicide and, destruction of the city. And, but prior to this, what I found in the sources, without having this kind of grand narrative or grand theory direct me, is that there was a lot of profiling of the indigenous population. The police would stop them because the way they looked, rural. They looked from the hinterland. They were not allowed to wander the city freely. They were often asked about, what kind of job they had, whether they could, who was their guarantor when they wanted to rent an apartment or a house, and so on and so forth. Women specifically roaming around were often stopped by the police. They were monitored by the neighborhood chiefs. So just from the stories that I found in the police records, I could tell that, the rural migrants were profiled all the time. They were considered suspicious all the time. The police wanted them, out of the way because they were not, often in line in the way they dressed, in the way they behaved with this kind of modern city, modern metropolis that was being created at the time. So even I remember something from your book, about the removal of the mastabas from the streets, the benches where people sat, when this was really removal of this kind of, social gathering of rural migrants or of indigenous Egyptians in the city. So a lot of the sources that I consulted gave me this idea that they were being removed from view. And this was not only in the photograph, but also in real life. They were being profiled, they were being tracked, they were being removed. They were not free to wander around in the city. And for me, this kind of, eventually translated into a form of exclusion, of erasure, that I could find reflections of in other works that talked about, this kind of urban colonial violence exercised in cities, and that formed this idea of the herbicide. And also another thing that's central to this theory of herbicide is this idea that, a city is essentially, it works, it's alive if people are living well. The living well is the raison d'etre of the city. And a lot of the rural migrants that I encountered in the sources were not living well. The census spoke of hard labor, people working in really back-breaking jobs. Seasonally, they're controlled by the guilds. And women also being kind of, tracked and followed and monitored all the time. So were they living well? They were not living well in the sense that it wasn't, there was a lot of kind of, suffering and even the story of how these mud brick homes were made. Essentially, Alexandria was able to exist or to become this kind of, mega port city is because a lot of rural migrants dug the canal in grueling conditions. So the idea of also living well is really, challenged by the lived experience of rural migrants as I encountered them in the documents. But they all wanted to live there, right? So the expulsion, the police was really, if anyone was found out of line, found to be suspicious, they were immediately deported and sent on boats back to their villages. And everyone wanted to be in Alexandria because compared to village life at the time, Alexandria, even though life was difficult, it was also a place of opportunity. The port was bustling, they could find work. It's a place that was more free than the village in a lot of ways for a lot of people. So they followed their relatives to Alexandria. The soldiers, Aishash, were basically a pull factor for a lot of villagers to come and just stay in Alexandria with a soldier who's a relative, a sibling, a cousin, etc., etc. So everybody wanted to be part of this metropolis, even though life was difficult. So in that sense, Robert Hilbert's work, of course, is it was always challenging for me, Robert Hilbert's work, because it's the type of work that you could find anything in it, but it also tells a story of Alexandria that is not centered on the local population, even though they could be mentioned as one of the communities, but it doesn't tell the history of the city from their perspective. And it kind of treats them as just one aspect of a big puzzle, of a big mosaic of communities that existed in Alexandria, and it kind of recreates this idea of the cosmopolitan coexisting communities living in this place, which is really one of the things that I challenge in the study, in the research. Yeah, but yes, thank you so much.
I think it falls to me to thank Dina, to thank visitors, some of whom have stayed up late or got up very early, and also to thank the audience here in Melbourne who've been here since 9 o'clock this morning, and for you all to join me and give Dina a warm round of applause. That was brilliant, and that concludes our day's activities. Well done, Dina. See you soon.
Thank you very much, Zoe. Thank you very much. Thank you, Omar and Mike for accepting the invitation. Thank you, Professor Panel and Andy for supervision, and Zoe.
Bye-bye.